Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Waiting for the last colleagues to come in. So, welcome back to this second day of the roundtable on equal access to justice. Thank you, everybody, for being here this morning. I'm not going to say too much. I will give the floor to Miguel in just a few seconds, but I wanted just to take this opportunity to thank very much the Ministry of Portugal for the wonderful hospitality yesterday night and also for the visit of both the Sintra Tribunal and the Innovation Hub. I found that really extremely impressive and inspiring. So I'm sure you join me in thanking our host for that wonderful evening. Now I just want to give the floor to Miguel, who will be introducing today's work. Thank you.
Merci Irène et à tous les collègues de Oecd. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, good morning. I once again thank you for your presence, and I hope you had an enjoyable working session yesterday and especially enjoyable dinner at evening. We start our second day with a panel entitled From Innovations to People-Centered Justice Ecosystem, which is a very broad theme, giving us the opportunity to listen to different types of presentations from basically, like yesterday, from around the world. I just, as a very, very short introduction to the topic, I just would like to I brought just a picture. It's the picture in front of you, which is also an example of technology and access to justice. Not the common picture that everyone probably today would immediately figure IT and justice, but is a 17th century new technology related to access to justice. This is a picture of in Colombia, in a monastery in Colombia, of the so-called in Spanish Ventanilla de la Denuncia. So it's the window for complaints, where people could be anonymously accused of having a member of the clergy, the other side, to listen to these accusations that could lead to, at the time, to a judicial case. So I think that, well, it's just a small provocative starting point, just to say some things we all recognize, that of course we think about and we talked about access to justice, and we integrate that with the use of technology, a better use of technology, and better services provided to people. Yesterday at evening, we were talking about how the evolution basically in the last 10-15 years was from how to integrate technology in courts in order to increase their efficiency. And today we are talking not only that, but we are talking about how to provide better services to people who need to use the justice system, how to grant broader access to populations more fragile in the terms of exercising their rights, and so it's a big evolution in a quite short period of time. However, history also has taught us that not only technology for justice is absolutely new, but we cannot probably separate an idea of access to justice from its content. And access to justice has some value, but we can probably never forget what type of justice are we providing. And the window of complaint is, I think, a good figure. Well, everyone likes to see pictures. It's our Instagram moment of the day, and but in trying to instigate also this reflection, access, but access to what? How the requirements that we can apply to our justice systems cannot be overthrown, cannot be replaced by just better access. So danger awaits also, and after and behind every window of complaint, of even the windows of complaint of today. Ladies and gentlemen, so thank you for your presence. We'll starting our discussion this morning. Geoff will be our moderator for this first session, and I'll immediately give the floor to him. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone, and welcome. And I will do my very best to speak for the interpreters. I unfortunately have a problem. I speak very quickly. The first session this morning, as you have heard, we're discussing from innovations to people-centred justice ecosystems. And this session is actually broken into two halves. In the first half, we'll be talking about inspiring policy change. The second half, after the tea break, we'll get on to the issues of technology. But we're starting off with the first part to talk about, I guess, inspiring change. Now, we've all learnt over the last 20 years or so in particular from all the legal needs work that legal need is quite widespread in the community, perhaps more than we thought. It's not evenly distributed. A small number of people, in Australia it's about 9%, have 2/3 of the problems, legal problems. And they don't just have legal problems, they have complex health, housing, employment, social, family and other problems as well. So the challenge for us is to meet those legal needs in an appropriate way that's also affordable and sustainable. Now, there's been some wonderful, and we've seen some over the last day or so, some wonderful developments and innovations and transformations in court systems. And let me make it quite clear, courts are fundamentally important, and coming from a common law country, courts actually make the law in many cases. But also we need to recognise that whilst very important matters are decided in courts, a large number of the ordinary citizens for their matters aren't actually in the courts having their matters heard. And so we have a challenge before us in designing an ecosystem, if you like, as to how do we, if we want to focus on inclusive growth, and that is making sure that we provide access to justice to bring all citizens on board, we need to come up with a system that's going to meet that needs, as I said, appropriately, affordably and sustainably. Hazel again yesterday helpfully pointed out to us that, or two things amongst others. One is that it's a very complex system, and the second thing is that in fact in most of our countries probably there's not likely to be a huge increase in funding going to justice, and obviously we hope there will be increases. But there's always going to be the challenge of competing with healthcare, education, housing and so forth, there's unlikely to be, and certainly in the UK she wasn't expecting, a mammoth increase in funding. So we come to this question of how do we come up with a system of, an ecosystem if you like, that's going to be appropriate for the needs of the citizens along pathways that they want to use and they can use and that are accessible to them, that's affordable and sustainable. And so the discussion around the concept of this ecosystem, this access to justice ecosystem that's people-centred, and how we can think about that. Now the OECD in our programs ask some very useful questions. Can we envisage what such an ecosystem might look like in terms of how we seamlessly connect how citizens at whatever level for the particular problem they have, how they can enter this system and there can be accessible ways and affordable ways for them to address those problems. What principles of regulation and so forth that might be. How do we inspire the change? What's the role of courts? What's the role of all the players? And how do we actually move from our current system, inspire policy change to get to this ecosystem? So it's a bit of a big vision, a bit of a challenge here, but we have to start somewhere. We've been given a very useful, very thoughtful and experienced panel to speak to us today, and I will introduce them now briefly before asking them to all give their addresses, and then we can hopefully have time for questions. First, and I'll introduce them all together, and Felix Stefek from the University of Cambridge is appearing remotely. Now, is Felix is on net, is he? He's there. So welcome, Felix. I can't see you at the moment, but I can now see you. Welcome. Welcome, Felix.
Hi. Hello.
We also have on the panel João Tiago Silveira, former State Secretary of Portugal. Welcome, João. We also have Chris Coxon, Principal Analyst, Access to Justice Analytical Services from the Ministry of Justice in the United Kingdom. And then we have two from the United States. We have Danielle Hirsch, Principal Court Management Consultant at the National Centre for State Courts. And we have Liberty Aldrich, Managing Director for Centre for Court Innovation. And so welcome to you all. I'm sure they'll give all interesting and quite different perspectives that will lead us to give us some food for thought to how we might start to move towards this ecosystem of sustainable access to justice. And I'd like to begin now by inviting Felix to speak. Now, I'm told by the organisers that you all have been told you have between 6 and 8 minutes, and I'm sure we'll all manage that quite well. So Felix, welcome, and I invite you to speak to the group.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to speak to you remotely. I'd like to kind of set the scene a little bit, and I'd like to speak on 4 issues. First issue would be how to implement a people-centric approach that is at the heart of the OECD's framework. Then secondly, how do we empower the parties really to take responsibility of their conflict and its resolution? The third aspect, it would be what the specific role of the courts would be in such a reconceptualized system. And then fourth, and that is the most ambitious point, I'd like to ask the question whether it is time now to consider the next step be ambitious and what such ambitious steps could look like. So first, looking at the people-centric approach. At the heart of the people-centric approach the OECD takes is to understand that people are driving dispute resolution. Now, this might mean that we might have to reconceptualize the mechanisms of dispute resolution that we're used to, and reconceptualizing them through the eyes of the parties to a conflict. If the parties to a conflict really and truly matter, then policymaking and designing institutions of justice should take their perspective. Now, quite often, mechanisms of dispute resolution are designed and characterized using the provider's perspective. And I think that on the handout we find a first attempt, or the session notes, a first attempt in reconceptualizing dispute resolution mechanisms through the eyes of the parties. So questions could, for example, be, Who initiates a dispute resolution mechanism? Is the party in control or is someone else in control? Then who determines the procedure of a mechanism? Do the parties control the procedure? What about the content of a resolution? Are the parties determining the content, or is it someone else? Then who decides whether such content takes effect, whether it's mandatory for the parties or not? Is it the parties themselves or someone else? Who chooses the neutral that helps the parties find a solution? And then who controls whether information is becoming public or whether it stays private? Is it the parties or someone else? Moving on to the second aspect, that is, how do we empower the parties to really take responsibility of their conflict and its solution? I think three issues might guide us. The first is differentiation. The second, a comprehensive set of dispute resolution mechanisms. And third, a consistent framework for the parties. First, differentiation. Now, if we look at the users, and they are the starting point of designing justice mechanisms, then different users have different interests. And this might mean that we have to offer them a differentiating framework of dispute resolution. And this in particular then calls for a set of different dispute resolution mechanisms that is truly accessible for the parties. Because there's not one type of dispute resolution that is then better than the other. It is just that there are different types of dispute resolution that serve different conflicts. Now, second, offering a comprehensive and also understandable framework of dispute resolution means that users need to understand the core features. Well, it might be the experts designing dispute resolution, but it is the users and the people who need to understand them. They need to understand the core characteristics of dispute resolution mechanisms available, what their relationship is, and if there's a cross-border dimension, then what that cross-border dimension means for them. Now, historically, I think that litigation and perhaps arbitration are quite well established and known to users. However, that is not often the case for other forms of alternative dispute resolution that are often less clear to the users and the people. Now, this then puts users in a difficult position as regards choosing between different types of dispute resolution mechanisms. If they do not understand the core characteristics or the relationships between various forms of dispute resolution, then how can they make an informed and adequate choice? Third, consistency. Quite often, dispute resolution mechanisms, I think, have developed piecemeal, but rarely do we find a consistent set of dispute resolution mechanisms. And this means that there's consistency in terms of what the cost of dispute resolution are, what the limitation periods are that apply to different types of dispute resolution mechanisms, what the confidentiality rules are, and how results of dispute resolution are enforced. Now, if dispute resolution mechanisms are not consistent and are not based on consistent set of principles, then parties will actually not choose the mechanism that best fits their problem, but they will choose the mechanism that kind of arbitrarily responds to a certain issue, for example, costs. So if the state subsidizes one dispute resolution mechanism more than the others, then it might be the costs that drive choice rather than whether that type of dispute resolution mechanism is really best suited to the parties' needs. Now, what does it mean for the specific role of the courts? As mentioned, I think that there's not one best type of dispute resolution mechanism, rather different types of resolution mechanisms that answer different problems. But the courts will always have a special role to play because they are the last resort and they represent the power monopoly of the state. In our times, this then, however, raises the question whether the courts should be accessible to all and for all types of disputes, considering that court services may be expensive in two ways, and that is both to the parties and the state. From that perspective, maybe it is the courts who might be in the future the best place for an effective triage system, helping people on their way to the best dispute resolution mechanism suiting their problem. And this then could also help to focus judicial attention only to those cases, on those cases that warrant the judge's attention. And then finally, my last point, is it time to consider the next step? Is it time to be ambitious? I think it is. I think we've collected now experiences with different types of dispute resolution mechanisms, with ADR and courts. But if we look at the reality of the rules, then we often quite find that there are extensive codes of court procedure that really dwarf all other types of dispute resolution mechanisms and their rules. And I believe it might be time to rewrite the rules that we have and develop comprehensive codes of dispute resolution that cover all sorts of mechanisms and their relationships between each other. And lastly, I'd like to mention the one-stop shop approach. One-stop shop solutions are an accepted reality for state services, and the OECD places emphasis on it. Now, how would a one-stop shop approach look like if you consider dispute resolution? Maybe can we offer the parties a one-stop shop in terms of all types of dispute resolution mechanisms in a country, or maybe differentiating between different types of resolution mechanism? I think these are questions that we might ask, and I would like to recommend being ambitious in the interest of a people-centric approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Felix, and perfect for time. And I'd now like to pass to João, from the former State Secretary of Portugal.
Many thanks, Geoff. Good morning to everyone. I would like to ask the staff to insert my PowerPoint, which I sent yesterday for the presentation. I've been asked to present some cases from the Portuguese experience where we could get some inspiration for people-centered justice ecosystem. So what I tried to do is first to provide you some examples from Portugal, and after that to present you some inspiration and ideas I believe could be useful for our work. So first I will refer to one reform in Portugal about Portuguese courts and IT system, and reforms on the registration services. Because in Portugal, a registration of businesses, land registration, vehicle registration, and civil registration, which stands for marriages, divorces, the registration of born citizens, is performed by services of the Ministry of Justice. And then some inspiration for new ideas. So let's start with IT system, where Portugal performed a huge reform on the using on the IT in courts with a new IT system, so-called CITUs. This is much more than just an IT system. The idea was to fully reform the procedures before the court. This provided for full online access to lawyers to see the status of the court they filed before the court, parties to file cases and send documents to the court without the need of sending mails or to go to the desk to the court to present paper copies. For judges and staff of the courts, they all performed their acts and decisions using this IT system with electronic signatures, and we have reduced paperwork on the court because there was obviously a simplification and streamlining of procedures inside the court with using of these IT tools. Electronic notices to parties during the court procedure started to be only held by means of using of this IT system, and whereas CITUs was also created an electronic order of payment, which is a very much used procedure used by Portuguese lawyers to recognize that there is a debt before a creditor, and this is again a judicial procedure. Well, There are obviously an online procedure for the enforcement of sentences and for the seizure of goods on that procedure for the enforcement of sentences. Nowadays, this is commonly used in Portugal by lawyers, by judges, and by all the Portuguese courts. Well, there is a different system for administrative courts, but the number of cases before those courts is much lower than the other ones. So this is the day-to-day work of lawyers, judges, and people staff in Portuguese courts. There was obviously a reduction of paperwork from the court. The procedure are obviously swifter. A lot of acts which were based on decisions on paper or which were required due to this paper procedure, which were eliminated. Obviously, a reduction of courts. Well, I am professor at university and I am lawyer as well. I know which were the works of the lawyers to present the case before the court. Commonly, they had to go before the desk of the court and present not only one, but at least 4 paper copies of all the documents before the court. So this was a huge difference for lawyers' works, for judges' works, and obviously for costs for the parties. Now just look at the last bullet, which is data from the statistical data headed by Miguel Romão on my right side. Look at the reduction of the time frame of civil cases where the average time before situs on the third trimester of 2007 was 29 months, and it was reduced to only 18 months on the third trimester of 2009. So the huge reduction we can see here was due to the starting of the use of situs. Nowadays we were able to reduce a bit more. I believe this is the result of several different reforms, but also to the use of situs, and now we have an average time of 15 months. Now let's look a bit to registration services. Felix was talking about one-stop shops in the courts. So let me give you 3 examples. We would have some more on other acts of citizens' life or companies' life where we have one-stop shops on registration services. We have a one-stop shop for the incorporation of businesses where you only go to registration services. There's no notary deed, and you perform all the required acts before finances, social security, registration offices in this one-stop shop. I believe the average time a few years ago to create a company in Portugal was 35 minutes. We have Casa Pronta, it's a one-stop shop for real estate, to buy and sell houses and properties, and again, you perform this out before registration services. We know notary deed with communications and payment of taxes and so on and so forth. And we have Nascer Cidadão, to born citizen, which is the possibility for you to have a one-stop shop in hospitals to registrate the born of a new citizen. All these services for vehicles, land, businesses, and civil are also online services by means of eGov tools. If you want to create a business in Portugal, you can go to this one-stop shop, or you can obviously create your company by the using of these eGov tools. They are all available to internet, to common citizens, or to professionals which may need to work on the registration offices. Now, on what concerns online access to registration information, the way we eliminated certificates in paper regarding the registration was by means of this permanent certificate, certidão permanente. If you want to access information from those registration, you online ask to a registration number, you pay an amount, and for a certain period of time you receive a code and you can access this information, which is always updated. You can deliver that code to any single entity which may need to see your registration, and this entity will be allowed to see the information of your company or your property and or any other information without requiring paper certificates and with an always updated information. And we have this also for the accounts of the companies, which is mandatory in Portugal after they approve their accounts. Finally, we have eliminated a lot of unnecessary acts on those registration. In Portugal nowadays, in general, there's no requirement for mandatory notary deeds. We have eliminated the publication of acts of companies' lives in the National Gazette paper, and we have eliminated the territorial jurisdiction of registration offices, and nowadays you can go everywhere to ask and perform the registration you need. Now, very quickly, let me present you some ideas of how can we build up new reforms for people-centered justice ecosystem. Now, first, let me suggest something that, in fact, it is written in the Portuguese program of government, a contract with targets and milestones to make justice accountable for citizens. I believe that an annual contract signed between the Ministry of Justice and the Council of Judges, so the entities able to manage courts and the system of courts, setting targets and milestones would be very useful, because this would be public information for people and companies to make justice system accountable, both politicians and other entities entitled to manage judges and courts. Now, this public contract would have an outcome for the citizens. They would be, and obviously they would be able to assess the results of this contract, and should have no more than 1 or 2 milestones to be easy to be assessed by people, and for judges and people in court staff to be able to focus their attention and activities on what is really important. This data obviously should be made available for the accountability of this annual contract, and I believe that if the goals and milestones are achieved, a bonus should be paid, not for a judge or a member of the staff of the courts, but to the team of the court, which was able to deliver a good result for people. So a public contract to make citizens, a justice system more accountable, I think it would be a good way to center the justice system on people and not in court staff or in courts professional. Now, the second idea is to provide case load management practices and tools. I believe there are, we could consider a lot of measures on this topic. For instance, providing new caseload management port powers for the court manager. In Portugal, we call it administrador judiciário, but in fact, it does not have powers to manage the caseload. This is for the judge. Now, there are a lot of activities which could ease procedures before the court and make them swifter if you provide powers to this court manager. Again, this court manager should be specially trained for management, and he is not specially trained for caseload manager. Situs could provide new management tools for this professional and for the president of the court. And nowadays, Situs is a very useful and practiced tool, both for judges and for lawyers, but is not very focused on providing data for for court management. Yes, 1 minute. And finally, I think that IT systems should be able to allocate cases to judges or to different courts, taking into consideration caseload and pending cases, as long as this criteria is transparent and accountable. Now, finally, 2 ideas on alternative dispute resolution. I believe this could be more used and new services could be provided for alternative dispute resolution means. For instance, in Portugal, new services on family law could be provided for the justices of peace, which are small claims courts, and the government should instruct public authorities to accept administrative arbitration on public procurement conflicts where we already have administrative arbitration made and performed by institutional entities. Thank you very much. I'm sorry to take a bit more time.
Thank you very much, Joel. Some exciting ideas there that I'm sure will prompt discussion later on. I'll now turn to Chris Coxon.
Thanks, Jeff. Do I have a presentation? Thank you to the OECD and the Portuguese government for the warm welcome as usual. I thought the food and the music was great last night, actually. Did make me wonder what we'd do if we ever hosted in London. It would probably be fish and chips in the park, in the rain, probably. Here we go, thank you. So I'm going to talk a bit about quite a specific piece of policy that we're working on at the moment, which is to do with legal support and how that's provided, focusing on kind of how we got to this position and also how we're going to move forward a bit in future. It is quite specific. It's quite specific for a broad topic like this, but it does cover a lot of ground and it does lend itself quite well to the theme of this session. Do I have a thing to move the presentation on? So in February this year, quite recently, we published two quite major pieces of work related to access to justice. The first of those was a review of a very significant piece of legislation called the Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Act, which had basically kind of big cuts to the amount of legal aid that's available in England and Wales. And then complementary to that, a much wider strategy, which is about legal support for those experiencing justice problems. It's the second one that I want to focus more on today, because that kind of looks forward to the future and lends more towards kind of early resolution. I did bring both of them with me today. I'm not quite sure why. They only really add to the weight of my luggage, but you can see the first one is a much longer. This is a 300-page report. It's full of stats, data, a lot of sort of civil service type drafting in there. It's certainly not a light read. Seem to be missing a slide. It was a major piece of legislation, and it made lots of recommendations about not only legal aid and what we do about legal aid, but a lot of wider themes came out as well about legal support and how we provide that. And just to sort of set the context a little bit more, the reforms to legal aid were very, very significant. I'm missing a slide, but they reduced the scope of legal aid, they reduced the eligibility of legal aid, and they also reduced the amount of money that was paid to providers for their services. That affected in particular civil and family cases, so lots of matters were taken out of scope. And the scope reforms were perhaps the most significant because before the Act was passed, all matters were in scope unless explicitly excluded. And we reversed that, so everything was out of scope unless specifically included. So that had big implications, and we cut the amount of legal aid. We still spend a lot on legal aid, but the amount that we spend went down from about 1.6 billion to about 1.2. So the review itself, as I said, made lots of recommendations about legal aid, but also more widely. We got a lot of feedback on legal support, and in particular early problem resolution. There's a lot of text on this slide, and I won't say it all, but one of the main pieces of feedback, and this won't be news to people around this table certainly, was the importance of early intervention. And that's, it's ideally before court as early as possible, but not only that, it's about providing appropriate advice and directing to the right services so that people can resolve their problem at the right time. Another thing that came through very strongly, particularly from the advice sector, we see people with quite complicated clusters of problems, was that it's very rarely one person comes with one problem and there's one solution to that. There's a lot of underlying drivers, of course. even if the person who has the problem doesn't even realise that themselves. And then we had some issues with advice deserts, particularly for some kind of areas of law, immigration and housing, rural areas where people don't know where to go to access advice. And that's an interesting thing in our country, which is actually quite small geography, that we had this specific issue. And then problems, and Hazel mentioned this yesterday when she spoke about litigants in person, the kinds of problems that they experience when navigating the formal legal system and the courts. So those themes are identified in the review, and they're explored in more detail in our Legal Support Action Plan, which is the second document. That looks at different options for how legal support can be targeted more effectively, in particular early support before problems escalate. It does acknowledge the very complex nature of understanding legal need and delivering appropriate services. And also, we do have this issue within the Justice Department that we sometimes seem to be responsible for demand on the system and all the drivers of demand. And a lot of these issues are upstream of our department and the remit that we have. Research and evidence, and as an analyst, this is very important to me. They're very fundamental to the development and the implementation of the strategy. And just to sort of unpack that a little bit, a lot of what I said before about the kind of problems people experience, I said they're not new to people. But in a way, we'd kind of, I think politically, we'd lost the narrative a little bit about the whole problem resolution journey and thinking about the justice system as a full system. We focused a lot on cuts to specific areas. And as well as getting feedback from people who work specifically with people with problems, frontline advice providers, etc. We were able to draw on, we're very lucky in England and Wales to have a rich base of research evidence, including things like legal needs surveys, which of course Hazel pioneered and Pasco has taken forward a lot. And we were able to kind of bring the narrative for some of the key messages, for example, the link between unmet legal needs and serious social consequences further down the line. We were able to put that front and centre into the briefing. And it was quite an interesting example, even though it's not explicit in the strategy, of how that kind of broad evidence base can influence policy thinking and change the narrative. So that was quite, an interesting thing to be able to be part of as an analyst. So this strategy is a starting point. It's quite broad. There's lots of refinement that's needed. We've got to do a lot of consultation and engagement before we actually start putting things in practice. Just to give you an idea of some of the actual components of the action plan. And I'll skip through these fairly quickly. There's more to it than this, but for example, different forms of access to early advice. We're going to be putting a series of pilots in place, ways of delivering legal support services, right from kind of information signposting, self-help, through to more targeted face-to-face services, including co-location and the one-stop shop. Comment has been made already a couple of times. We're going to be investing more money in litigants in person. We have a litigants in person support strategy, which we're going to be putting more money into. We're going to be doubling the funding for that. There's an innovation fund which we're putting in place. People are very excited about this back home. We're going to try to make grants available for innovative new legal support solutions. We're not trying to be prescriptive about what those are at the moment, but they're quite likely to be in the IT and law tech space, although it could be other things like innovative funding models could be part of that as well. 5 million is not a huge amount of money in the grand scheme of things, but we hope it's enough to just plant a few seeds and start driving the market in new directions. And then finally, in terms of legal aid itself, there's quite a few kind of initiatives specific to that. One specific thing that I'll pick out is a pilot to expand legal aid back into a specific area of social welfare law. That's likely to be housing cases where people are having quite immediate problems with possession of their homes, and that potentially leads to homelessness and obviously the damaging consequences that go along with that. Last slide. Again, as an analyst, I wanted to just kind of point some of these things out. I won't dive into lots of detail, but there's a lot of challenges. The whole point of this exercise is to find out in more specific terms what works in terms of different forms of legal support. And in order to do that, we have to understand how to evaluate, how to define outcomes, how to actually assess what works, and that's challenging with a lot of this stuff. And Natalie spoke about this in the court reform context. A lot of what she said actually holds true for earlier resolutions that are further up the pipeline. More practically, we've got kind of balancing the obvious demands of actually understanding what's going on properly with the need to be timely, and we've got limited resource. Some of this, we still need to make the case to the Treasury. This came up yesterday again. We need to put a strong case across to the Treasury for some of these pilots. Causality and attribution is linked to the above on defining outcomes, really, and then we've got obvious issues with data, how we measure and baseline, and controlling for, because this is such a broad space, there's all kinds of interactions and other government policies that are going to be kind of hitting at the same time, and controlling for those. For example, the housing pilot I mentioned, a change in benefits eligibility criteria could have a big impact on outcomes, so we've got to try and kind of look at that as well. I'll leave it there anyway. That was a bit of a gallop through. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'd now like to ask Danielle to have her.
Hello, bom dia. Thank you all. This is an incredible space to be in and a really rich conversation, and I'm so grateful to be here. So thank you. My name is Danielle Hirsch, and I'm with the National Center for State Courts. I'm sorry, I'm a Luddite, so I don't have slides. You're just going to have to hear me. But my roadmap for my 8 minutes with you is to talk a little bit about my organization and a brief snapshot of the state courts, which will make the bulk of my time focused on one project about access to justice strategic planning. So the National Center for State Courts is an organization that was a non-governmental organization started in the early 70s. Because our court system is bifurcated. We have a federal court system that hears cases involving federal laws passed in Washington, D.C., or between states. But most of our court cases happen within each of our states. So we have 50 states and D.C. And so about 90% of cases, most of the cases I would argue that affect real people happen in state court. Last year it was estimated about 46 million civil cases happened in state courts, in about 15,000 courts across the country, but each state operates totally independently. So the National Center for State Courts is supposed to be a think tank to bring states together to share best practices and to share learning. Of the 46 million civil cases that I talked about, that's about 1 in every 10 Americans, and about 3 of every 5 came to court without a lawyer. So we're seeing demographic sea changes in how state courts, who they're confronting. I thought for purposes of today, I would spend my time on a project called the Justice for All Initiative, which my office leads, but is really a collaboration of a number of important people, because I think it gets to the idea of planning for people-centric justice. It really started in 2015 when the Conference of Chief Supreme Court Justices met and formed a resolution that committed to strive for 100% access to justice. So not just, as was talked about a lot yesterday and with Professor Sandifer's research, we know that the majority of people who have legal problems don't actually come to court. So we traditionally focus only on the people that come to court, and we talk about self-help and ways to meet those users better, and that's really important. But we also have to plan for the people who don't know they have a legal problem and might need some legal help. And so if we're going to get to 100% access to justice, it means a paradigm shift in what we're thinking about and how we plan. And so this initiative is to assist state courts in doing that more broad sweeping paradigm shifting and planning. We have generous support from a bunch of U.S. philanthropic organizations, including the Public Welfare Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, and the Open Society Foundation. And while the National Center for State Courts is the program lead and directs the program, we do it with a number of other vital NGOs and local partners. The goal of the program is really a twofold process to get states and their partners to map an access to justice ecosystem in their state that looks beyond the courts and the court players, but thinks about holistically how people get information and where they go, who are their trusted allies when they need help. And it provides funding for that kind of ecosystem analysis, and then after that year is done, it provides funding to try a 1-year implementation pilot of one aspect of the project. So it's a 2-year project, and throughout that, my organization provides technical assistance to those state teams to think about various ways to approach the process, as well as some tools, which I would be happy to share with anybody interested, about how to engage in this kind of gap analysis and also planning for the future. So at present, we have 11 US states that have engaged in this work. The planning year is really focused on 4 or 5 components. I guess my math's not great. Okay, inventory and gap analysis, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, which we broke the internal part into 16 components, which I'd be happy to talk with at the break. But the inventory is a more wide sweeping, holistic approach. We want the state team to think about governance, who's going to own this wider sweeping process going forward, and sustainability of the work. So we have 2 years of funding for these states, but how they're going to sustain the work beyond that, how they're going to communicate about legal aid and legal need, and then how they're going to strive for continuous improvement and evaluation. So I would like to spend the remaining few minutes with you sharing 6 lessons that we've learned from 3 years in. The first is that I think courts must lead in this effort for access to justice, but they can't do it alone. And so while courts have to be at the table and I think have a wonderful ability to bring actors together, if only judicial branch people are at the table, we're failing in serving 100% access to justice. The second lesson is I think the wide sweeping inventory and gap analysis takes an enormous amount of time and some thinking outside the box, that we are really an interconnected web of services and communities. You not only need to understand your court data, which can be challenging, but you need to audit the information that you provide in courts, and then you need to think about who are your partners outside of the courts. And so it's shifting a focus to where the majority of the people turn for help when they have problems, and trying to figure out from them what kinds of resources we can provide to help those people. So I wanted to give you a concrete example. In Alaska, they did something called a social network analysis, where they were able to map where all the lawyers in the state practice, where all the law enforcement agencies are located, the public libraries, the medical hospitals, and see where there are deserts and gaps. And then they did a survey of all of those different kinds of users about who their clients are and what kind of potential legal needs those clients might have. And through that analysis, it identified some obvious gaps. So for Alaska in particular, when they did the audit of all of their available information and they talked with all of their providers, they realized a lot of community members needed help with debt collection, and there were no resources on the court's website about debt collection, and so that became, in their implementation phase, the project they focused exclusively on for the court part. But through these kinds of gap analyses, public libraries became a key focus point for New York State. Religious community leaders became a focus point in Georgia. Human service providers were identified strongly in most of the states, but especially Hawaii and Minnesota. Law enforcement and medical community became key in Alaska, and community job training centers became also a targeted focus in Massachusetts. And so to think about, you're not trying to get those different community groups to become lawyers, that would be ridiculous, but what you're trying to do is get those communities to partner with the courts in a more meaningful way, to understand what the needs of their constituents are, and also how they can potentially issue spot and then hand those people to the available legal resources. My third lesson is that technology can be a force multiplier, but it is not a solution alone. And so we have a number of states that are working on website portals and automated forms and online dispute resolution, and those are all wonderful ways to serve people, but that at the court portion of it, the court also needs to think about, are all the materials in plain language? Are all the processes as simplified as they can be? Are we meeting the users where they are? My fourth lesson is that this effort, it remains to be seen because it's so new, but it requires really sustained governance for this work as well as sustainability. So the test will be what happens when we're done with year 2. How do these states continue? I think one thing that helps a lot with governance, because it's bringing together not only the court, the bar, and mediators, but if it's done right, it's bringing together law enforcement and the social sector, is some common principles that guide what the work is. And also engaging for sustainability with both local philanthropy and business, and making the case why this is relevant to them. And Hawaii has been really successful in leveraging this work for local philanthropy support. So the Hawaii Justice Foundation has continued to support it along with some other community foundations. And in Minnesota, they leveraged local business support, not so much to fund the courts or legal aid, but to provide technical pro bono assistance in computer area in particular. So Target's IT department, which is a big commercial store in the US, their IT department has helped with privacy protections for the new website, and they did all of that pro bono as part of this kind of corporate partnership. My fifth lesson is that the court part of this process needs to embrace disruptive innovation, that with demographics changing, the way that they have, courts need to think differently about how to serve users. And then my final lesson, which I think is the most important but also most challenging, is that collaboration is really critical, but it is incredibly hard work. I would be misleading if I told you this was really easy or this could be done in one simple meeting. Meeting community partners where they are is a two-way street, and it's a long-term effort, but it results in meaningful public trust and confidence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Very good. Very well done. And finally, I'd like to call on Liberty.
Good morning, everyone. In the US, when you say good morning, people are expected to say good morning back. We do call and response. But anyway, so it's great to be here, and it's appropriate that I'm following Danielle. The Center for Court Innovation is kind of like the crazy cousin to the National Center for State Courts. So I am going to just spend a minute introducing the Center for Court Innovation. For those of you who are not familiar with our work, we do three things. We run large projects, which are really demonstration initiatives where we test ideas. We then perform research, and then we try to work with jurisdictions that are interested in replicating those ideas. And so this is similar to what we heard yesterday from the Secretary about how they've sort of piloted, failed, tried again, and then looked at replication. So that is our business model. I don't need to go into that. So the Center for Court Innovation focuses really on these key issues that many of you have talked about already. I just want to clarify, we really don't look at sort of other civil justice issues, so commercial law, registering vehicles, all of those things are extremely important and cause backlogs and headaches for court systems. Danielle can pay attention to that. We really focus on the needs of the sort of, I forget, you said 9% or 6%, or sort of the highest need folks in our communities who are the most frequent users of justice services. So, all right, I'm going to skip this too, because I think these are all the things that we've been talking about today and really do link all of our work. What are we trying to do? We're trying to rethink how justice can serve our communities. What are the different kinds of services that may not have been traditionally offered? And what are the different responses? And not to just look at individual problems, but to look at community problems. So We've heard mention, and Danielle just mentioned, stakeholders and outsiders. I just want to say, when we talk about outside stakeholders at the Center for Court Innovation, we really mean outside. So I put outside, we have garden programs. We partner with entrepreneurship training programs. In one of our courts, pilot courts, we run a music studio for people to produce their own music. We will do anything that we can to think of how to engage the community with the Justice Center. So we look at all of our programs as platforms for experimentation. We may fail. We are not in your position. We are not the justice system itself. We are outsiders brought in by courts or justice system players that are interested in trying something new. So for us, we're always looking at what might be a new approach. So I mentioned calendars, and we talked somebody mentioned problem-solving courts yesterday. That is one of the main things that we work on, but we also are piloting restorative justice programs that are either connected or not connected to traditional justice sector stakeholders. Diversion options, and that was mentioned yesterday about diversion. We're really talking in this context about diversion from criminal prosecution, so early diversion, pre-processing for arrest. We last night at dinner began a vigorous debate about assessment tools, which in the U.S. is a huge topic, and it's a way, obviously, we need to be thinking about what are the underlying needs of the folks who are coming to our court system. So how do we identify those needs? How do we identify the risks that those folks may present as well, and do so in a way that is neutral, respectful, and unbiased. Yesterday also, folks mentioned procedural justice, but I do think it is a central core concept that is a helpful way to constantly think about access to justice and what does it mean. Treating litigants with respect, understanding that litigants must feel the process to be neutral, that they are given a voice, and then the fourth thing, which of course is very difficult and is a lot of what folks have talked about in terms of help centers, is that they understand what they're being asked to do. And we could spend lots of time talking about all of those, but I wanted to focus on three initiatives. One is community court model, and specifically Red Hook Community Justice Center. The second is integrated domestic violence courts, and the third is a project called Legal Hand. The community court model is kind of the opposite in some ways of a lot of the things that I've heard talked about in the last day. What we are doing is creating, in a way, new courts, but they are community-based and really designed based on what those local problems in that specific neighborhood are. So in Red Hook, which is a small community in Brooklyn, New York, small by our standards, it's 200,000 people, we created a standalone court in 2000. I just want to highlight a few aspects. It is sort of a one-stop shop, but again, this is one stop a little bit plus. So yesterday we had a court plus, but this is plus maybe, I don't know. It's one stop in that it's housing cases, criminal cases, family cases. We have an on-site clinic, which means all social services. We have on-site government services, so public benefits, healthcare. We have a peacemaking program, so for folks who are not aware, peacemaking is a traditional Native American approach to dispute resolution, and we have trained neighborhood folks in Red Hook to conduct peacemaking sessions, which are separate from the court. So for folks who are talking about people who don't want to access the court, this is one possible avenue. We have on-site victim services. We have classes for people to get their high school diploma. We have lawyers, of course, intake center. And all of these services are available both for people who are voluntarily coming there and people who are coming because of a justice system case or specific case. You can come in and use the services whether or not you have a case. Oh God, okay. Gosh, you guys, it's so much easier when you're so the integrated domestic violence courts were designed for one judge, one family response, and they hear all cases related to the survivor of domestic violence. So I think that's fairly obvious, but again, this is to simplify the court process. And then I put a picture of Becky Sandifer on here somewhere just to troll her. But anyway, yeah. So the final thing I was going to mention is the legal hand model, which is something that we developed in conjunction with New York State, which trains community volunteers to address legal needs before they come to court. So we do not serve anybody who has an active court case. We only serve people with legal issues that are not in court and not yet justiciable. So a lot of those needs are related to family, housing, benefits, all of the things that we can discuss. I don't have time to talk about the response, but anyway, I look forward to discussing more.
Thank you very much. And that was a wonderful collection of speakers. And just before I invite some comments, I just want to touch on a couple of things that came out of that, if I may. We start off with a good start with Felix talking about, a bit philosophical, I guess, coming from people's perspective, not from the provider's perspective, which is, I guess, something we've all been guilty of. The fact that there's inconsistency of development of all our processes and the need for an effective triage process when coming at it from a citizen's perspective. Assessing the person and saying, what's the most appropriate solution for you? He then encouraged us to be ambitious. Joel then also raised a very important point into reforms in IT and processes, because certainly in many of our countries, there's focus at the top end, there's focus on perhaps those disadvantaged ones, but what's called sometimes the missing middle, he didn't use that term, but I will, for improving processes, making courts faster, quicker, easier access for perhaps those of us around the table here, makes the system run better. It frees up resources for including others. So those are all very positive reforms as well. Chris gave a really interesting point from the United Kingdom, and I'd just like to say that even though they've had lots of cuts, legal aid in the UK still gets more than most of us does, so they're still doing okay. But he raised a couple of important points about what drives demand, and that's, I think, a key point, and what the flow and effect down the track is. There's been some talk in some areas of, if you like, a justice impact statement. So in other words, before the Department of Education or Housing or Transport introduces new laws, they should be asked to say, what's the impact down the track on justice, cost for justice, and cost for legal aid and so forth to assist people? It's something worth thinking about. He focused on what works. Danielle, I found her presentation particularly inspiring with what can happen from courts and a paradigm shift, to use the term. And the idea of looking at it from the perspective of a court group, looking at the perspective of getting beyond just the courts, looking at mapping the entire justice advice and the whole sector in its widest possible connotation in these regions, and then looking at coming up with solutions, I thought was really interesting. And some of her lessons, I think, were were very interested. We in Australia find that public libraries, for example, we have legal information passing through public libraries and so forth. It's focusing on where the people actually are and where they go, as opposed to where we would want them to go or where we think they go. And so I think that was wonderful, Danielle. And in Liberty, again, it's great to see, again, a court-based thing, looking at experimentation and looking at the way forward. And I'd just like to say the key elements of Liberty's thing, Liberty's presentation, talking about the community court and so forth. People don't have legal problems. They don't even have state problems and federal problems. They have problems. They have a whole range of problems: housing, health, social. Some of them legal, some of them are not. The legal one might not even be the most important one. Getting a roof on my head tonight might be more important. But they have these problems. The developments of this integrated sort of court model of bringing all these services together is one of the innovations that people are trying, and I think that's worth considering. So I'd just like to say that the OECD put together a great panel there in great sequence, if I may say. So well done, Tatiana. I think there's a really good range of interesting initiatives there. I'd now invite you, others to, in the time available, to, if you've got any questions or like to make some interventions. And I think, I'm not sure what the rule is, but you can put your little name tag that way. And if you want to put your name tag that way, I'll know you'd like to say something. Otherwise, a hand will do. And I've got Rebecca over there, so let's start with you, Becky.
I'll use my professor voice. These were great presentations. Thank you very much. And they're really wonderful illustrations of the way that jurisdictions that are structured very, very differently can achieve really organization. So what you pull off in a very centralized country, you would be very differently in a place like the United States. I was very inspired by our Portuguese colleagues' descriptions of ways that courts can be accountable for what they do as public actors. And I wondered, this is for the whole panel, what your thoughts are about how we might achieve that in these very different jurisdictions, and what the relationship is between that kind of accountability and public-centered access to justice.
Okay, and as I don't have any other questions, let's ask the panel to answer that. Would anyone like to? Perhaps, Joe, you should perhaps start with that.
Yes, I would say that the relation is obvious because nowadays, well, let me rephrase and restart. In some of our countries, we have this kind of accountability. There are places where we have public targets for courts, and I believe in USA, you have a problem in the USA because you don't manage centrally the courts. Therefore, you have a lot of different experiences from different states. But in some states, I believe you have targets for courts established by the courts themselves. Now, I think the relation is obvious because nowadays in some of our countries, not to say a lot of our countries, we do not even know which is the average min time of a court to decide. So they are not accountable, and there's no data to make them accountable for the citizens. So I believe this would make clear which are the targets and goals of the courts for the public and for public institutions to scrutinize them. And I believe it would be a very useful data to know and ask, why did you not met the goal? And rationally to discuss if this is a problem, not necessarily to apply a penalty to somebody, but to act as soon as possible if there's a problem, and what shall we do to improve the results for the next year?
Chris, I'd be interested in your comments, Chris, from the UK perspective, from a common law jurisdiction. Answer the question.
Yeah, we have a lot of judicial reviews and guidelines that kind of govern how court processes operate and so forth, and those are kind of they are gradually put in place. There's lots of kind of there's been lots of efforts historically to kind of improve processes, but I think the problem we have judicially is it's mainly guidelines, and the enforcement of them is pretty inconsistent, and we do suffer a lot in the UK, particularly in the civil justice system, between problems of excessive delay and a lot of complexity. And there's differing kind of opinions on whether a complicated, very intricate legal system is actually kind of what we want, and there's a judicial and kind of legal kind of perspective on that. And that's kind of quite contradictory to this more sort of citizen-focused, agile approach that we may kind of need to be adopting more to, meet the demands of the court. So, I mean, a lot of our reforms at the moment are to do with trying to simplify court processes to make things more efficient and user-centric. But yes, I mean, we do have a very old-fashioned and very kind of, historic legal system that actually, many would argue doesn't lend itself well to the way that modern justice needs to be delivered.
Liberty?
Yeah, I would just, courts have historically struggled with transparency, some good reasons for that and some very bad reasons. But I guess I would caution that just even based on the responses, often when courts are being held accountable to something, it's guidelines around timeliness and efficiency, not taking into account actually people-centered responses, not based on the user experience or other needs, which are much harder. It's hard enough to track timelines, but it's really hard to get in-person feedback on the experience of court users. So I would just, if we are going to be held accountable, it should be to that.
And I just have one other, I practiced in Chicago for a long time, and I was working for a foundation, and we explored partnering with the courts to get a social innovation bond to support a help desk where the deliverable was how many people we served and the outcomes for that. And so that's in the few minutes we've had, that's the only way I can think of how we could actually be held accountable in a more meaningful way to a specific target. But it's a great question. It's one I think about. Thank you.
Natalie, do you have a point on this? Would you like to come forward to borrow someone's microphone? Maybe that might be.
Firstly, just to echo Rebecca, thank you so much for those brilliant and really interesting presentations. I'm really interested in following on this idea of making courts accountable, and I wondered, is better use of administrative data an answer? In the UK, there's some interesting projects being led by different foundations linking data, for example, in the family court, to understand what the downstream consequences of upstream engagement with the family court are. And that's responding to judges' calls who have said, we make decisions that purport to be in the best interest of children, but we actually don't have a really good evidence base for what happens post that decision. We did some work at the foundation I work for, reviewing use of administrative data, and often data on civil courts is wholly absent from that. And I wondered if any of the other speakers from different countries had good examples of where linking data from the courts to other administrative data had led to new models or new ways of reforming court processes in the interests of people.
Okay. In fact, you've sort of taken the question and moved off to one side. I just want to finish this point about accountability, if I can, as well. That I think it's an interesting question. I know that, again, in Australia, the issue of monitoring superior judges' performance is a sensitive issue. It's often occurred to me that we, in some ways, we'd be better off focusing on the lower level of courts and tribunals and actually tracking numbers of people who are there and unrepresented litigants and so forth, and actually that's probably where the majority of people are and so forth. But still, it's an interesting question. It's a hot issue at times. You then led on to the issue of outcomes, and about the following up down line. And in fact, it was a question that Sergeline asked yesterday at the court, but we didn't know about do you do any follow-up type work look at outcomes. But I thought that was interesting. It is a point about the outcomes and what impact are we having downstream. Does anyone want to make any comments on that?
I think it's a really, really interesting point. And just to add, you mentioned family justice, and I think administrative justice is also a really interesting issue, isn't it? Where you have, with civil justice, problems come from so many different routes, don't they? But with administrative justice, every tribunal hearing is an appeal against a government decision that's been made further upstream, and the quality of that decision and how it's been made has a huge impact on demand of the courts and the experience of people. And understanding that is where we've got quite a direct link, and we can actually monitor that and share data better to improve that process. And there's a lot of work and thinking being done about that. But actually, even something that's probably the most straightforward example, and even that actually has not been cracked and is quite difficult. So with civil justice and family justice, where problems they're not rooted in such a straightforward way, the situation is even more complex than that.
Chris, a question?
My name is Chris Griffin from the United States, and to continue on this theme of accountability, I agree that the focus that we tend to have on building a people-centered ecosystem from the court staff perspective and making sure that processes there are streamlined is the right way to think about this. But I'd like to encourage and get thoughts from the panelists about how the courtrooms themselves may be subject to particular types of accountability, recognizing that judges have to perform their official duties as they see fit and that they retain their discretion. But at least in the United States context, to the extent that I see in the field where the conduct of even a summary proceeding can vary so widely from courtroom to courtroom in ways that do not promote a people-centered ecosystem of access to justice, are there ways of, maybe through judicial training, alongside the establishment of new processes from court administrators, are there ways to, dare I say, hold judicial officials more accountable for being a part of this ecosystem?
Do I have any takers from the panel?
Please.
Oh, sorry.
Can I speak? Okay.
Okay, so, yeah.
Yes, thank you.
So go ahead, Inès.
I wanted to answer the question. I would tell it in French, it's more easier for me. Comme je vous l'ai dit hier, je représente le ministère de la Justice français. Il y a une nouvelle loi qui a été publiée il y a 2 jours. Et concernant cette question des affaires civiles et des affaires familiales qui sont très importantes, bien évidemment pour nous aussi, puisque les enfants sont au cœur finalement de ces décisions parfois difficiles à comprendre pour les parents, on a une nouvelle disposition qui impose en fait ce qu'on appelle une médiation post-sententielle et qui donc oblige les parents à aller en médiation pour se faire expliquer la décision pour convenir ensemble de la meilleure façon de l'appliquer. Parce que parfois, la médiation, c'est compliqué à faire avant parce que les gens ne sont pas d'accord. Ils veulent absolument avoir le recours à la justice. Et je suis bien d'accord avec tout ce que vous avez tous dit, à savoir que parfois, c'est difficile parce que les gens ne comprennent pas ce qui a été décidé pour eux. Ça a été décidé en droit. Et en fait, on trouvait que c'était une nouvelle disposition qui était intéressante parce qu'elle oblige les parents à réfléchir ensemble à comment faire que cette décision de justice puisse s'appliquer. Et c'est bien la preuve qu'on ne laisse pas les gens tout seuls avec leurs décisions et que... on fait en sorte que ce qui est jugé, en tout cas, soit effectif dans l'intérêt des familles et des enfants, ce qui est vraiment important. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. No, I had that. Yes. Okay. All right. Daniela.
Okay. Thank you. This is to go back to the issue of accountability and to one of the ideas shared by Mr. Silvera, which is about the contract between the Minister of Justice and the Council of Justice or for the judiciary. And I think that in this respect I have 2 remarks. It made an echo in my mind from many different perspectives in comparative terms. As you know, we have different systems of judicial governance, not only in the European Union, but also in Latin America, so the models are very different. But nevertheless, most of the time, we have the Minister of Justice, which is involved for the resource, and the Council of the Judiciary is, there to protect, to ensure the judicial independence. So, and the combination of the two is not easy, but first, I think that 1 year is a time frame a little bit too short. For the reason that once you have just put in place the measures that you want to have, then you need the time to implement them in order to collect the data about the result that you get. Secondly, I think that it is important to have in the contract, or whatever it might be, an agreement or a planning, it doesn't matter, the type of situation that you have in the courts, because if you want someone is going to reach a goal, you need to know which is the possibility for this person or the organization, it doesn't mean that it's a person, to reach the goal, and the room of maneuver, which relates directly to the status of the chief of the courts, which is related to the Council of the Judiciary. So I think that this is a sort of, a macro agenda on which it would be interesting to go in depth. Also because these two institutions are most of the time involved in the data collection. And there you have basically the engine of many mechanisms of accountability, but you need to make sure that accountability is possible, not only, suitable. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. I have 3 more interventions, and I'll ask the panel to sort of respond if I can. Trevor, first.
Very quickly, I'm conscious of the time. I'm thinking about the people-centered pathways, obviously way more options than courts, but when we do talk about courts, one of the things that seems in my mind to be happening is we're laboring under the notion that the perfect is the enemy of the good, meaning that in courts, we at least in our country, we really try and put on perfect justice. And I do wonder whether something much more creative, much more modest, but much less perfect, more rough, might get more court justice to more people to keep the public system on the map. I don't have a perfect framing, and I'll shut up now because I know others want to speak.
Thank you, Trevor. I like it. There was one here. Belgium, sorry.
Merci beaucoup. En écoutant toutes les interventions qui sont vraiment très très intéressantes, je me disais ceci, des banalités, je vais dire des banalités. Les nouvelles technologies sont essentielles, évidemment. Les nouveaux processus sont essentiels aussi. Le budget doit être suffisant, et je plains nos collègues britanniques après les coupes sombres dont ils ont parlé hier et aujourd'hui. Mais je dirais que ce qui est au-delà, ce qui est essentiel, c'est l'attitude des professionnels. L'attitude des professionnels de la justice à l'égard du justiciable. Il y a des moments clés dans la justice, dans l'œuvre de justice, et je pense qu'il ne faut jamais oublier que la plupart des justiciables qui se présentent devant un tribunal, devant une cour, c'est la seule affaire de leur vie. Statistiquement, en tout cas, c'est la seule affaire de leur vie. Donc pour ces personnes-là, c'est vraiment très important. Donc sérieux, respect, ponctualité. Ponctualité. Si nous nous rappelons simplement la question de l'arriéré judiciaire qui est une catastrophe, nous le connaissons en Belgique, la Cour d'appel de Bruxelles fixe des affaires en 2021, en 2022, en 2023. Nous sommes en 2019. Vous imaginez naturellement l'effet de cette information sur la personne. Donc, ponctualité, sérieux, respect de la part du juge, de la part du magistrat du ministère public, et également de la part du personnel des greffes et des avocats. C'est essentiel. Il y a quelques années, j'enseignais le droit de la sécurité sociale à l'université et j'invitais mes étudiants à venir à une audience du tribunal du travail. Et la première réaction des étudiants, c'était « on a l'impression que les professionnels n'écoutent pas la personne ». C'était la première réflexion. Ce n'était pas des questions juridiques qu'ils relevaient, c'était l'attitude. Et ça, je pense que c'est vraiment essentiel. Comment y remédier? Par la formation des professionnels, en n'oubliant pas que, certes, formation juridique, bien sûr, mais je parle d'une autre formation, la gestion du relationnel avec la personne qui se présente devant un tribunal, devant une cour, la gestion d'une audience, comment on gère une audience, la dimension pédagogique de l'œuvre de justice. Ça me paraît vraiment essentiel. Et j'entendais la collègue française dire qu'on a légiféré, et ainsi donc on oblige en quelque sorte d'expliquer la justice. Je trouve ça quand même, on va très loin. Ça veut dire donc que les professionnels de la justice n'expliquent pas leurs décisions. Ils doivent le faire en principe dans leurs décisions, ou en tout cas trouver un moment. Et ça, naturellement, ça n'entre pas dans une question de statistique. Ça prend du temps, ce n'est pas rentable. Mais qu'est-ce que c'est rendre la justice tout compte fait? Si on veut vraiment mettre l'être humain au centre de l'œuvre de justice, il faut prendre du temps.
Thank you very much. And the final intervention before we wrap up is Finland. Finland, sorry. Can't see from me.
About the accountability and target setting, it was asked how it's used in different countries. In Finland, we have been doing that for 25 years. So every year Ministry of Justice makes an agreement with each court about their budget and at the same time what is produced with that budget. And we have three main figures how we follow up. It is how many cases per person it's in court, how many euros per case, that's another figure, and the third is the run-through time of cases, the average run-through time. And I think that has been very essential when we allocate the money for the courts. So that's how we did allocate the resources for the courts. And it doesn't come so deeply into the value, into the quality and outcome in that sense, but about the run-through time, that has a meaning, and I think it has had an effect. When we come to the quality of what's happening at the courtroom, we have very much training for the judges, and I think that's a better tool for achieving results there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've almost run out of time, and just before I sum up, does anyone on the panel have anything specifically that needs to be followed up on from those interventions very quickly?
I just wanted to add to both Chris and the gentleman from Belgium, there are a number of judicial training kinds of programs that ought to be embedded. So just off the top of my head, I came up with procedural fairness, implicit bias, interacting with self-represented litigants, language access, and in the United States, often that means how to work with an interpreter, which is new to people, how to speak and write in plain language. And then in Illinois, where I'm from, we tried a poverty simulation because a lot of judges had never interacted with challenges of poverty. And so actually seeing how difficult it is to prioritize court when you have so many immediate needs, we found to be very valuable for empathy building.
Very quickly, other ways of making courts accountable, obviously, for instance, as some of you have said, on the clarity of the wording used by judges, or on the clarity of the notices from the court to make them understandable by people. We have some experience for that in Portugal, but there are a lot of other tools that you can use for improving accountability and make the justice system centered in people. Contract, annual or biannual, well, it depends, no problem on a contract of a more long-term contract. The only issue is to make the period of the contract shorter than the legislature. Otherwise, there would be no political responsibility. Differences on national organization, obviously, you would have to take that into consideration. In Portugal, the role of the Ministry of Justice is very important and therefore should be central on such contract. And on the allocation of money to the courts, obviously that could be a consequence of the compliance or not with the targets of the contract. And some countries would probably work better than others, but I think that our work should be to have a set of possible outcomes and consequences for a target met or not. So, thank you.
Look, thank you, everybody. I'll just sum up now, and I did a bit of a summation of the key contributions before. if I was going to sum up this session of the contributions people made, I would actually, and say where to in the future, I would take a word from our Belgian colleague who used the word attitude. Yeah, and that comes in an attitude of, I guess, paradigm shift was also used. Sergeline used the word of having to explain to the people to actually understand it, taking away from just thinking about it from a judicial perspective. I think trying to inspire a change, it takes that attitude, whether it be the courts trying to expand their view as to not just looking at the courts, coming at it from a perspective of what actually the citizen experiences and what they want and so forth. And so looking forward then, there's a number of issues. We've heard a number of different initiatives here. I think one of the big questions is to continue to gather what are the good practices, what works. I think that's a challenge ahead of us, and I think it's a challenge that the OECD is well placed to be at the heart of collecting. We need to collect all these good ideas and evaluate them and test them, and there's some testing happening here, so we can actually learn and we can then decide to adapt to try and come at it into the future. So I'd suggest collecting good practices, getting a deeper understanding of what the citizen wants, I think is a way forward, and I'd encourage us all in the OECD to do that. We've got to work out ways to inspire our governments and funders, courts, to really look at, have a paradigm shift, to change our attitudes, to come at it from the citizen's perspective, going right back to the very first contributions from Felix about coming at it from their perspective rather than the provider's perspective. I think that the session has gone extremely well. I hope it has for you. It's 10:46 and a half. I'm 1.5 minutes over time for morning tea, but I hope we've got something out of it, and I think there's a great forward step, both for the next session, which looks at technology, this next step, but I think beyond that, for the OECD more generally, and for all of us to say, well, okay, how can we move towards this ecosystem that is actually more user-focused? So thank you very much. Thank you.
The next session will begin at 11:15, so now please join us for the coffee break.
His face didn't have to be in the back.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Dear representatives, dear colleagues, after getting freshened up by coffee and the wonderful Portuguese pastries, I think we have enough power and sugar again to continue with the topic and bring it from the general user perspective of justice to the technical component a little bit and to talk about how to use technology and data in closing the justice gap. And two questions more or less will drive these sessions. First one is about how can technology help to overcome the barriers and facilities in creation of a seamless centered justice ecosystems. Which kind of challenges on the technical base do we face? What kind of risks are also with that kind of developments, of course? And we try to discuss that from a very practical point of view. I just want to start with an example that shows a little bit distraction of the current development. If you imagine likely a divorced couple looking for a solution on the elementary problem of their kids, then it is very common that they can look into the internet and can inform about the regulations, about the calculation, and they may be coming up with an idea on how to calculate the elementary, but then they are forced to go to a court likely, and then they have to do a trial or a debate in front of the court, and the result maybe is the same like they could have had on internet. But I don't know any kind of solution yet which is offering a smart contract where those people can do this in the middle of the night by themselves using an algorithm which is enforceable at the end. So a little bit, I always say that even if in modern times, by the means we apply, we're still a little bit like in 19th century when people who had a dispute stood up in the morning, saddling the horse, riding to the court, having the dispute there, at the evening riding home, likely one was more lucky than the other, and that's it. And even if we apply technologies nowadays in the court system, it is still a little bit this saddling the horse and riding to the court, maybe by PDF, maybe by some other technology means, but still not using the potential which is now really deploying in front of us. So this is one aspect, that there is a lot of technology around. Keywords like blockchain, artificial intelligence are on the horizon and in between us. And on the other side, technology became a driver to change the landscape of judiciary completely. If we think about that, eBay is running on dispute resolution 20 times more cases than the Austrian judiciary on a yearly basis, means that eBay is more or less the biggest judiciary in Europe, but it is not seen as a judicial institution. And the effect this has is maybe that cases which have been dealt in front of the courts in the past are not dealt by the courts anymore, but maybe by a private institution, maybe in the future by an algorithm. And we cannot see these kind of cases anymore, which also raises questions then on the political level, if we are in favor of that state authorities are dealing with our disputes, or maybe it is better handing over to private institutions or even an algorithm doing this on an objective base. So a lot of things around changing and to be discussed, and therefore I may introduce our panel consisting of a lot of interesting peoples, and I may start in the order of our agenda and welcoming Hugo Nunes, advisor of the State Secretary Cabinet of the Ministry of Justice in Portugal. Then we have Luc Altman with us, Deputy Head and Insight and User Research Division of Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service of the UK. We have Jennifer Mary from the Register State Courts in Singapore. She's a deputy presiding judge there. Anna Skriabina is project leader of the Justice for Growth and Court Administration in Latvia. We welcome Daniela Piana, research director and chair political science of the University of Bologna, but also active in Paris and in Roma. And last but not least, Ludwig Bull from the Court Quant initiative. And I may, exactly in this order, give the floor and start with Ugo to invite him to make our minds floating into the world of IT and technology and data using to closing the judicial gap.
Thank you, George. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Hugo Nunes, and I work as advisor for the Portuguese Secretary of State of Justice. It is a privilege and a pleasure to participate on this OECD event, and I'm very grateful to be able to share some thoughts from our experience here in Portugal, and above all, to learn with other contexts and realities, trying to transform together justice and promote better access to all. From our first day here in this ministry, it was clear to everyone that one of the main challenges would be to change perceptions, ranging from media, opinion makers, conjunctural lobbies, but also from inquiries with common citizens and business. There were a generic impression of dramatic slowness of courts, an anachronistic way of doing things by the justice professionals, which many times unfairly contrasted with the reality. Instead of denying it and frontally fight it, for instance with intense communication campaigns or orchestrated counter-lobbying, we decided to act in two complementary ways. First, try to understand what created those perceptions. Sure, there were reasons in the past, even if eventually don't apply anymore, and others still happening. And to do that, we had to listen. Listen. Put ourselves in their shoes, try to reproduce their experience, grasp their expectations. Secondly, we assumed the risk of transparency. Open our doors, our services, our data, subject to comparison, interpret the pressure that comes with this posture as opportunities to improve, to change. And then show how committed we are to transform ourselves aligned with real needs, to collaborate on producing results that represent wins for everyone, and through innovations and proper technologies, create value, accelerate change, and better manage resources. We started to listen, look for opinions, feedback, claims, and needs. We did that by exploring existing channels and creating new ones, questionnaires, media articles, forums, social networks, analyzing help desk and support reported issues, and promoting many focus groups. We contacted common citizens and small and medium business, our end clients after all, but also the professionals that with us constitute the justice ecosystem, ministry departments, central and distributed agencies, courts, conservatories, prisons, etc., clerks, judges and prosecutors, internal and external stakeholders, lawyers, solicitors, professional orders, high councils, attorney general, associations, etc. And then we structured a plan, Justiça Mais Próxima, closer justice, that you have already heard a lot about. Here, I want to emphasize that our modernization plan, that effectively makes us very proud of it, was only part of the established dynamic. Sure, surprisingly to many of us, simply its existence represented an innovation in itself. But was the way it was conceived, aggregating the ideas and opinions from everyone. Its alignment with general government plans, other reform initiatives, and also, of course, ministerial guidelines. Its holistic scope, the commitment to timely and ingeniously executed, the periodic, monthly, and direct report from specific and concrete persons from all the justice ecosystem. It was also the transparency of publicly publishing results, good or bad, and the support services made available, a funding support team, a PMO office, an allocated communication department, etc., that keep this plan relevant until today. The initiatives identified, more than 170 nowadays, ranging from atomic and very specific ones, to complex and rolling out another sub-programs comprising sub-initiatives like Tribunal Mais, Court Plus, and Court's digital transformation, took maximum advantage of existing and emergent technologies as a mean and not the end in itself. Agile methodologies, co-creation design thinking, and other collaborative approaches, of broad usage of administrative and procedural simplification, process re-engineering, and the dematerialized standard as a reference. We created spaces, hubs, labs, as you yesterday visited, and above all, promoted a cultural shift supported by innovation and a continuous improvement mindset. We believe that by, on the one hand, focusing on what people really need and design solutions that effectively fulfill the generality of situations, but also fringes and vulnerable contexts. And on the other hand, by maximizing efficiency, freeing resources to what is most important, facilitating the usage of services and access to data, and more importantly, information about them, to the citizens, but also for all the professionals. We believe by all that we'll create a better and sustainable justice and a more informed and legal empowerment society. And in the end, these two forces, knowledge and efficiency, will produce results visible now and enduring for the next generations that being effectively experienced by all, from citizens to professionals, turn on facts and finally change perceptions. Here are an overview of some of the main initiatives addressing different quadrants of roles, directly or indirectly in the hand, converging to citizens and businesses' satisfaction and needs. Some of them are better in detail explained in a History of 3 Years transformation book that I believe was shared with you, and generically depicted also in the Portuguese case study preliminary highlights from Oecd presented yesterday. In the afternoon, during the Room 2 session about MENA Working Group on Regulatory Reform and the Rule of Law, I'll address some of the projects. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Hugo, and we will take note of some of the interesting aspects to address questions later, and we'll continue with Luc on the same questions, and Luc, the floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to talk to you today about how in England and Wales we are using data to help design and deliver a justice system centred around the needs of users. I should have some slides up, if that's possible. I will firstly and very briefly talk about the programme of reform that we're undertaking in the UK, and then discuss the example of the Social Security Tribunal, the work that we've done to date, the impact that has had, and the challenges we are facing in the future. So we're building a modern system for administering justice, which will benefit everyone who uses it. This £1 billion change programme for courts and tribunals is the most significant set of reforms to the system since the 19th century, and having formally begun in April 2016, it's due to complete in 2023. By way of example, we've put in place the digital case system in the Crown Court, moving us away from paper bundles and saving us from printing over 93 million pages of paper. But the area of the reforms that I'd like to focus on is in tribunals, where 500,000 of our 4 million cases sit. As you all know, tribunals is the part of the justice system used to resolve disputes between individuals and the state, the largest in the UK, which is the Social Security Tribunal, or SSCS, where citizens resolve appeals they have against the ministry responsible for deciding if you're entitled to social security benefits. Currently, the process has a number of areas that need improvement. For example, the average waiting time for a tribunal hearing is currently 27 weeks, and in over 70% of cases, the appeal is upheld in favour of the user, while the flow of casework is inefficient and there is very little communication between the government departments involved. To date, we've made it possible for social security users to submit their appeal online, and we have developed a system that allows users to track their appeal online and receive text and email alerts letting them know what is happening. And we've also started to develop a way for users to resolve their appeal online without the need for a hearing at all. And I'll mention more about that in a while. But I'd like to talk about the different research and data we have used to design and deliver and improve the tribunal. The first of those is user research. So the initial evidence that people needed this service to be reformed and the evidence to inform the design of the service is gathered through user research, which is a form of rapid qualitative research with people who are likely to use the system or have used the system. And from this research, a set of user needs are developed. And those user needs are the foundations of the design, making the design truly user-centered. This is a co-creation. An example user need from SSCS is, I need to understand where I am in the process and what is going to happen next so that I'm not confused. And this user need, among others, provided us with the evidence we needed to develop Track Your Appeal. The digital product was released to the public as a trial version in summer 2018, and we have collected and used insight and feedback on the service to inform further design choices. For example, we can measure the proportion of users who call HMCTS about the service, split by those who have submitted their appeal online and those who have submitted their appeal on paper or in the post. And we can see that at an absolute level, those who have submitted their application online, the blue line at the bottom, are less likely to call us than those who have submitted their appeal on paper. This is a finding we would expect and one of the intended outcomes of the design. In other words, we've designed the service to update users on the progress of their case so they have less need to contact us. And understanding this data in more detail allows us to optimize the design of the service to give the users the service that they need. And we also collect data on the reasons why they call us, and we can see differences between the online and the paper users. And in fact, although online appellants are calling us less, they're still calling us to get updates which we should be able to provide in the digital service. We also have digital feedback from which we can improve services in the early phases. For example, built into the digital service is an exit survey. The exit survey is a single question that asks users how satisfied they are with the service and the opportunity to type some feedback. From the written feedback, we've created a framework to code and analyze the responses. The first 700 comments provided us with 200 that were usable, including recommendations around features. For example, the digital service allows users to select dates in which they are unavailable to attend a hearing, something not available if you submit by paper and leads to hearings being missed. The feedback provided useful suggestions to how to improve the functionality of selecting dates, which was since implemented and added to the existing paper channel to reduce missed hearings for people who apply through that route. We've also used primary research to collect data about the users of the service. One of the key assumptions for this service is around people having the digital capability to use it. We know from previous government research that over a third of the adult population in the UK need assistance to use government services online. And we hypothesise that this group of tribunal users, despite being of working age, had other vulnerabilities and socio-economic characteristics that would make a large proportion unable to use the online service without help. And a representative survey of 1,000 users showed that as many as 2/3 of users would need some form of help. And what this data demonstrated is the requirement to design as simple a service as possible with the appropriate support for those with lower digital capability. It also helps us manage expectations about the likely take-up of the service over time and the need to retain the existing paper channels. So this is not digital design by default, because we recognise that for a lot of services we will continue to retain the existing channels. Digital capability is something we can measure through surveying, but there are other characteristics we can infer from other data we have about users. In this service we collect the user's postal code. We can map those postcodes as shown here and demonstrate the geographic skew of users to more urban and economically deprived neighbourhoods. Additionally, we can overlay previously understood information about people in those postal codes at an aggregate level that can tell us more about the user's characteristics. Some of these insights can help inform decisions, for example, decisions where users' location is important, such as in-person assisted digital services and the location of hearing centres. I'd finally like to talk a bit about continuous online resolution, known as CORE. The previous changes I referred to required the digitisation of existing court processes, but continuous online resolution is an entirely new route to justice. The objective of CORE is to enable the earliest possible resolution of a dispute while maintaining or increasing access to justice. It hopes to achieve this where the tribunal has reviewed the case information and decides that the case could be resolved without a hearing or by asking a few simple questions online. The user is invited to set up an account and provide more information online. A question or questions are asked that are as simple as possible. The answer to those questions could result in what is known as a preliminary view. This is where the tribunal have reviewed the additional information and they believe they have enough information to make a decision without the need for a hearing. The user has the option of either accepting the view or having a hearing. This process is in early development, but we've started to design and plan the evaluation, which will be critical to understanding if access to justice is maintained or increased. We started the evaluation planning with the creation and agreement of a logic model, the outline of which is shown here. Prior to our involvement, there were a mix of views about the purpose of continuous online resolution, with some stakeholders focused on efficiency of case management, others on speeding up resolution, and others on access to justice. The logic model has helped bring those different objectives together and agree the evaluation measures. What we have discovered in this work are the considerable challenges of measurement and evaluation when a service is being developed and improved very rapidly, and the early versions of the service are known to be different to any final version. Ideally, we would wait for a steady state to evaluate the impact CORE is having on the various outcome measures in which we are interested, including access to justice. And of course, we will do that when the service scales up to a wider audience. But for the first stage of testing, we will have only 200 to 300 users over a 12-week period, and the data that we capture during this time will be important for making decisions to scale up the service to a wider audience. During this time, we will gather quantitative data to understand how many cases can be resolved online, how long the cases take to resolve, and we will gather qualitative data to understand user perceptions of access to justice and feedback on procedural quality. For longer-term planning, we are ensuring early on that we are collecting the right data in a usable format so that future impact evaluations can take place, including randomized control trials, which are not currently practical. And finally, just to say, I would be interested to share more and also learn how others are addressing similar challenges. Thank you. A lot of interesting initiatives going on. We'll reflect them. Took note of a few keywords. But before that, we forward the floor and invite Jennifer Marie talking about findings, practice, and idea coming from Singapore courts. The floor is yours. Thank you, George, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to be focusing on how we use technology in trying to close some of the justice gaps. And I think what is important is to look at the context and to understand where we are coming from in Singapore. Context is important because jurisdictions vary and the needs are also different. So I'll give you some information about Singapore. I think a lot of you may have visited us. Not many of you may have visited the state courts where I come from. Now we have, with a population of 5.6 million and on a size of 724 kilometers, it's a very dense population. But it's a population that has digital savviness. So if you look at the data that we have amassed, we have about 87% of households have access to computers, 91% have access to the internet, and about 150% mobile penetration. This helps us in determining the kind of modality that we use to push out some of the information to our court users. And what helps us, and the other point that you have to look at is the digital government blueprint that was launched. So we are aided by the government's master plan. The digital government blueprint sets out that the use of data, connectivity, and computing was to use decisively to re-engineer business processes, re-architect technology infrastructure, and to transform services for citizens, businesses, and public offices. And there's an added dimension of serving with heart, a digital government that automates processes where possible so that we can better serve citizens with a personal touch in a way that enriches the experience. The government has set out three outcomes for three stakeholders: citizens and businesses, as well as public offices. For citizens and businesses, the focus has been on digital services that are easy to use, seamless, secure and reliable, relevant. Where did they go back? The thing is, it's not working. Oh, now it's working too fast. So you get a sneak preview, okay? All right, here we are. And then for public offices, digitally enabled workplaces, a work environment where they have access to data and digital technologies to design better programs, collaborate with other public offices to deliver better services and access high-quality internal corporate services to be more productive, and digitally confident workforce. A workforce with basic digital literacy and trained to harness data and digital technologies in their work. In this background, one of the blueprint requires skills upgrading. Skills upgrading of 10,000 public service officers. That's their target over the next 3 years to have some digital qualification. That's about 145,000 public servants. So this is a huge effort made by the government in trying to push through the digital framework. So what was then the response of the judiciary? The courts of the future. In a way, if you look at the timing, this was, it predates the whole of the government's blueprint. It just shows how the judiciary in Singapore is so forward-thinking. And we had established this in 2016. And the courts of the future, which is a judiciary IT roadmap, focuses on developing self-help solutions for litigants. Like some of you have shared a lot of the first, we notice it anecdotally, and then we have data to support it, that there are more and more persons who choose to appear in person in the courts, be it in the criminal cases as well as in some of our community courts. So developing self-help solutions for litigants becomes a priority for us. Developing solutions for efficient and effective justice systems. This means investing in technology to help us make processes simpler, and adopting the intelligent use of data. So the first response that we put in place was a multi-agency project dealing with integrated criminal case management and filing system. This was a project that was driven by the courts, and from our experience, when you work with law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, as well as counsel, in order to bring them on board, everyone seems to have their own IT systems. It becomes next to impossible to try and bring them together. The way forward that we discovered was to get the courts to drive it. With us driving it, and we got the funding from the Ministry of Finance to support this initiative, and 34 other government agencies came on board. And the system allows from end-to-end processing. So from the time a case is investigated and a police officer files his case, that's filed into the system, right up to the end when the case is heard, disposed of, and the judge sentences, that information is conveyed to the prisons department. So in a way, it's a paperless and a seamless system. When we started the process, we needed to bring in the buy-in of the bar. Law enforcement was not so difficult because it's a government agencies, and government agencies tend to understand the need to support each other in this initiative. But the bar had some difficulties because not all lawyers were as computer literate. So there was an issue about how they were going to file. But they could see the benefits because they could do this 24/7 from the office, from the comfort of the office. They didn't have to come to the court to do any of their filing of their documents. And importantly, what we found was we started as a phased approach. We allowed access to lawyers first. And then 2 years ago, we allowed access to the litigants in person. This meant that a litigant in person could see how their case was progressing through the court system. And what was important was that these were not just litigants who appeared in person, there could be litigants who had counsel representing them. The advantage was they were now aware of what their lawyers were doing, how quickly they were attending to the various applications as well. So we had some throwback from the lawyers, but eventually they could see that this made for a better system. I'm not sure how many of them agree to that statement, but I am sure they have come around. So if you look at the integrated case, very quickly, just an e-filing, e-workflow system. And the beauty of this system is that it allows us, because it generates so much of structured data, we were able to create a sentencing information and research repository. And this allows us to pull out the data coming out from these cases and to provide information about sentencing data for the purpose of retrieval, display, and analysis. So this information is readily available to accused persons, to academics, to anyone. The next thing that we did was when we looked at for small claims, the nature of the legislation is such that lawyers don't appear. A lot of the accused persons are left on their own to figure out whether or not the Small Claims Tribunal has jurisdiction. So this became a bugbear, and we decided to work on a simple online assessment tool. So this tool allows litigants in person, since they're all litigants in person, to have questions answered from the comfort of their homes on both desktop and mobile devices, saving them valuable time from coming to the courts and making these inquiries and standing in long lines. And in fact, this tool is the first of its kind to be used in the Singapore courts. It was designed and developed entirely in-house. We tried to stress to our in-house technical experts that we wanted to design something that was simple and easy to use and cost-effective. So they used infographics to present the information simply and clearly to the litigants in person. Then we got a little bit more funding, and we proceeded to come up with a little bit more complicated and complex system. I shouldn't use the word complicated, complex system, but it's easy enough to navigate even for the litigants in person. The Community Justice and Tribunal System. This system is an online e-filing case management system which has the online dispute resolution features as well, and is specifically targeted towards litigants in person. It represents a new and innovative, fully integrated justice solution. It allows litigants internet access, and they may use any internet-enabled device to transact anywhere within with the community justice and tribunal system. It allows for pre-filing assessment and, of course, online dispute resolution. And then we have progressed a little bit more, and this is the system that we are currently working on. And this is really focused on civil cases dealing with accident claims. It will be extended to maintenance disputes in the family justice courts. This is a system that looks at outcome simulators, e-settlements, and e-EDR and e-mediation. The system will be fully rolled out by the end of this year. Applications of artificial intelligence. What we had experimented with, and some of you have been sharing about the transcription services. In Singapore, apart from the courts speak, the language of the courts is in English, but we provide Mandarin and interpretation for other languages. From time to time, we find that providing transcription records has become costly and has taken a lot of time. So we've come up with, working together with A*STAR, an intelligent court transcription service which is able to utilizes deep neural networks, language modeling, and natural language processing. It's trained in court-specific vocabulary as well as domain-specific terms, such as medical terms for coroner's cases and engineering terms for industrial accident cases. So without using court reporters or transcribers, this system can transcribe in real time. Currently, the accuracy level is at about 92%. We're hoping that with time and machine learning, we will be able to reach what we think is the gold standard for manual transcription, which is about 99%. And so this is work in progress. And then, of course, we have the other AI system that we've worked with the NTU, with a university in Singapore, on the intelligent case retrieval system. And this is a tool that is able to assess and use machine learning for intelligent case search. And I just wanted to share a little bit about the sandwich class. I know yesterday there was some discussion about the sandwich class. Yes, we have legal aid for persons without means, but more and more we realized that there was this sandwich class. And how do we deal with the sandwich class? How do we push government to support or increase the means test? So in the state courts, we started off with a help center, and then we coalesced to the community justice center. This is a collaboration, and this shows that the courts are only one part of a much larger justice ecosystem. Developing people-centered innovation requires collaboration among stakeholders. So this Community Justice Center involves collaboration between the public sector, private sector, which is Law Society, and not-for-profit sector, Tan Chin Tuan Foundation. We'd registered it as a charity with the Institute of Public Charter Character Status, and this has helped in it getting funding. The Community Justice Center is located within the court, so it provides easy access for litigants to seek help and advice. As a non-profit organization, the CJC, although we work closely with the courts, has been successful in partnering other entities and leveraging on the flexibility that it enjoys as a non-government organization in terms of network of partners and source of funding. So this gives you an overview of the various partners. And one of the things that it was able to do, it was able to get funding and to come up with an IT system, which is a self-help e-web. And it's located on this Community Justice Center's website. And then, finally, it's something about clicks at state courts. I wonder whether the video can be shown. It's a very short video clip. It will spare me the description.
State courts of Singapore handles more than 90% of the judiciary's caseload. The new State Courts Towers is designed to provide the needed infrastructure to deliver justice in a timely and efficient manner. Modern and green, the towers will also host initiatives to prepare the legal sector for the future. This at State Courts is a co-working space that is first involved to bring together lawyers specializing in criminal law, family law, and community disputes, and the tech sector in a bid to develop tech-enabled solutions. The space
This will be officially launched next year when we move to the new building. The State Courts is in the process of moving, and I hope that all of you will have some time to come and visit us in the State Courts to view this. So, opportunities and risk. Technological disruptions are not new. Impact of new technology is dependent on society's response. So factors such as cost, efficiency, access to justice, and autonomy are matters that we take into account. Impact may be more limited in cases where there's a balancing of various factors and the exercise of discretion may well be required. If you ask me, why is it that State Courts is able to come up with a lot of initiatives and is innovative? And that's really because of the work plan that we have been organizing for more than 20 years. Every year, annually, there's a work plan which requires every division to review, rethink about how we are doing, what is it that we need to come up with, and various initiatives are then presented. And we are accountable for making sure that these initiatives are reach for fruition within the targeted period that we set for it. So this is just an example of our recent work plan initiative that was that we just concluded in early March. And before I should also stress that the State Courts, we use the platform, a benchmark framework, especially addressing the needs of the court. So for example, the International Framework for Court Excellence, I think most of you around the table will know. And this is the one that provides guidance to the State Courts to help us improve our performance. It's a framework of values, concepts, and tools which courts worldwide can use to improve court excellence. With that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot for this journey to the innovative justice in Singapore. And we'll come back to Europe, and I will move forward the floor to Anna to go to Latvia, because Latvia is also a very initiative at the moment in checking out new ways to deliver justice and having a lot of interesting projects in the pipe. So we may learn about more about this, and Anna, the floor is yours.
Good morning to everyone, and it's my great pleasure to be a part of the panel. And I will be focusing on the 2 points. As I'm representing the judiciary, I will be speaking on the usage of the technology in the judicial sector. And using the possibility and taking an opportunity, I would like to inform that, that we have established, in cooperation with Oecd, Access to Justice team, recently the separate access to justice and technology workstream under the Access to Justice Roundtable. But going to the usage of the technology in the judicial sector, and we are representing very small jurisdiction as Latvian jurisdiction. And I'm representing the Court Administration of Latvia, that is one centralized agency supporting all Latvian courts except of the Supreme Court. So we are administrative service supporting 16 courts of the first instance and courts of appeal altogether, and they are located in 35 locations. And the number of the judges is rather small in comparison to other states, so there are 550 judges and 1,700 court staff. And in the framework of the court administration, we are fulfilling the functions of the support, administrative support, and support of the human resources, financial support, development of the judicial sector, and also development of the technological part and of information technology part of the judiciary. So that provides us an opportunity, being so small jurisdiction, to be innovative and to try innovative examples and innovative things within our judiciary. That's why between all Latvian institutions, Court Administration of Latvia centralized agency is quite highly ranked in relation to the E-index. If we are looking on the current state of art and current situation in relation to usage of the technologies in the courts of Latvia, and I believe most of the mentioned are used in the courts of other states. But I would like to focus on one of the aspects mentioned here, the usage of the business intelligence tools. And currently, we are using the business intelligence to analyze the statistical data we obtain in relation to the work of the judiciary. And that provides us a possibility to overview the caseload and to identify the costs of the hearings and cost of the proceedings. And also being as a centralized agency provides us a possibility to have an access to the different database and to the different data we obtain from the different registers. And that provides us a possibility to estimate the costs of the proceedings in the future, so building the budget of the judiciary. If we are looking for the future perspective and for the initiatives already under elaboration and established, I would like to mention from all the initiatives mentioned here, especially the tool what we are developing now, as we have a portal of Latvian courts where you can obtain the information in relation to the proceedings, or you can submit claims and documents online. So also you can get an information online, and the tool we are developing and introducing is legal advice online. And this tool will be introduced and will be accessible at the portal of Latvian courts. And for example, I would like to divorce, but I do not know how to start the proceedings. And I go to the portal of the Latvian courts and I choose one of the 7 legal problems. For the moment, this tool is developed in relation to the 7 legal problems: debt, divorce, small claims, and I choose my legal problem, and this tool, in very comprehensive and simple manner, provides me the possibility to obtain the information with what step should I take as a first step. And for example, I even do not know that in Latvia the divorce is possible to be made by notary, and this tool would answer me then and provide the first information I have to obtain in relation to my legal problem. And for the moment, as I mentioned, this tool is developed in relation to the 7 categories of legal problems, of legal cases. And we will start to test it, and we will look on which legal problem is most interesting for the citizens. And also we are trying to link it with a court fees calculator to estimate the cost of the proceedings if I would choose to go to a court. And also to estimate the length of the proceedings depending on the jurisdiction, and also using the data which is available in the court information database. Also, we are looking on the possibilities to introduce the artificial intelligence in order to take the decisions for the small claims, but still there are ongoing discussions on which extent we could introduce the usage of artificial intelligence tools. And also we are looking on the possibilities to further extend the usage of business intelligence tools. As I mentioned, for the moment we are more interested in looking on the statistical data in relation to planning of the court budget and length of the proceedings, but also the distribution of the cases could be supported by the business intelligence, and using the business intelligence for case weighting and estimating and then how long the court procedure could take place. And once I talked on the initiatives that we previously mentioned, that legal advice online, so the idea is that also as a court administrator we bring the legal problem and we try to solve the legal problem also outside the court. And these initiatives are showing that we are thinking a bit broader than the court administrator and the court system as such. And this brings us to the idea that court is a part in the justice ecosystem chain that we discussed also yesterday. And all these tools should be seen and evaluated in some kind of comprehensive manner with other initiatives to be taken in the justice sector. So once you introduce the technology in the judicial system, so you can think over the broader perspective. And this brought us also to the idea that we discussed with the OECD Access to Justice team. And 2 days ago, the first meeting of the work stream established under the Access to Justice Roundtable took place. And it's an open call for all of you to join this discussion in more practical manner. And the objective is that in a 24-month term to discuss the good practice examples of the technologies used in the justice sector, not only in courts, and to come to the principles once we implement the technological solution in the justice sector, what could be the good practice examples and the best principles to evaluate which technology is in a comprehensive manner with an access to justice principles, and how to prioritize and how to develop this in strategical manner, and how to build the expertise in the framework of one state once you evaluate the implementation of the technology. And in a very practical manner, it's an open invitation to join for everyone. And there will be also the meeting of the experts organized by OECD Access to Justice team and BAS, and with a view to discuss the good practice examples. And the objectives of this work stream that I mentioned is in a very comprehensive manner to look on the potential of digital technologies to support the development of people-centered justice ecosystem and improve legal and justice services. As here in the framework of the Access to Justice Roundtable, we are talking on the broader perspective of the initiatives to support the access to justice. In the framework of this working group, we would like to focus more on the practical examples of usage of the technology to support the access to justice. Then also the second dimension would be that we stress the importance of user-driven service design and delivery to meet citizens' expectations and needs through the usage of data. Then also we will be talking about the risks and opportunities to minimize the risks and maximize the benefits in usage of technology, and in a broader perspective to evaluate the challenges in development of capacities and skills once the technologies are introduced. So, and as I mentioned previously, the objective is slowly to move forward some kind of policy framework that could be principles to be used in our states when the technological solutions are implemented in more broader perspective, not only in courts, but also in other judicial institutions. So, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Anna. And thinking broader is, I think, a good keyword, as we are used, especially if we come directly from the judiciary, that a case is starting when someone is putting a claim on the desk and it is finished if the judge is delivering this decision, but completely missing the point that the whole story starts maybe months before and will not end with the judge's decision. And if we think about the procedure and new designs, of course, we should focus at the real beginning, which is maybe not in the premises of a court, but definitely totally elsewhere. And I think this is a point to come back then later as well. In the meanwhile, we continue with Diana, who needs that pointer and device to perform the presentation. And I may hand over the floor to you, Diana.
Thank you. Thank you, Gerd. I have a presentation. So the Basically, and in short, the topic of my presentation is about virtual doors. One reason we wanted to have virtual doors is that, in a way, as it has been already highlighted, technology and digital justice changed the landscape of justice systems. I would claim that artificial intelligence, which is very much at the center of my presentation, is going to change the mindset of all actors that are involved in the justice system. So just let me go back to where we are. In a way, the reason we may today we may discuss about the use of artificial intelligence in the justice systems is because we have already many applications of technology in the courts, in the interface between courts and the external world. So this is exactly what we can describe as a facilitating condition. And it is important to have this in mind because those actors that have been involved in the implementation of technological innovations so far are presumably empowered, they get skills to be change agent and to facilitate or to, to coordinate when the artificial intelligence gets into the justice system. What's new, however? There are at least, in my view, three dimensions of innovation, of truly speaking innovation. First of all, as we have open and wide access to big data set, where case laws and judicial behaviors records are available. And here, of course, we need to highlight both the open and the wide access, which relates immediately to problems concerning, the openness, so the protection of personal data on the one hand, and on the other hand, this idea to have access to data, which doesn't mean, in per se that we have access to justice, of course. So this idea of having access to what is something that I think we need to investigate and to understand better. But nevertheless, around this, which is already available, because we have many data that are accessible on the, on the platform because of the digital justice, we have strong capacities to compute. So to create automation devices that can be incorporated in the decision-making processes. And again, we have also a lot of actors clustering in between private and public sectors that have been active in the digital justice spectrum, and now as the legal tech, so-called, they are now entering in a new age, in a new market, developing devices to apply automation and artificial intelligence in the justice sector. But this is, again, it concerns only the supply side. I think that what is very important here is to focus on the demand side. Citizens, economic actors, social actors do have a demand to access justice and mechanisms to settle disputes, and they want to have them capable to overcome traditional problems that have been affecting the justice systems. So there is a strong demand for more transparent, more accessible, more readable, more objective, more impartial, a lot of more, which creates a demand and also a legitimization to all offers that may try to meet this need that is more or less explicit, but is absolutely over there. And if we go, toward a people-centered approach, I think that it's important to break down the pathways that people follow when they go toward the justice system. And I've tried to portray in a very maybe simple manner the different angles and the different stages in which artificial intelligence can enter into the pathway that people can follow to reach the justice system. First of all, as it has been already highlighted, people do not have legal and judicial problems. They have problems. The fact that these problems are translated and worded in legal and judicial words, this is already a step in the pathway. And again, here it is extremely important the way artificial intelligence and automated devices can enter in. And in a way, they may be supportive, they may help people to understand which is the legal and the judicial spectrum in which a problem that for them is just a vital problem can take a legal and judicial dimension. It may be supportive, but it can be also biasing, misleading. So it is already here that we have a huge, working site in which the quality of the information, the access to data, let's say, is already a matter for policy. Then we have lawyering and all the wide world where the legal representatives and lawyers are in a way transformed by the existence of artificial intelligence, applications. We have many, I would say, experimental practices, but nevertheless, we are not ready to handle, to govern this process. And I think that from the side of the lawyers, there is, again, a huge work that should be done in terms of professional legitimacy, which is the role left for lawyers, where you have, for instance, automated decision-making processes that can intervene in advising people that want to have litigations settled. This is also more important in cases of ADR, where you have small claims, for instance, that are addressed with a low-cost system of justice delivering. And finally, I think that in the judicial decision-making process, we start to see and to debate across different countries how judges can be supported, advised by what is called predictive justice, and to what extent the judicial decision-making processes and sentencing can be, in a way, I'm not saying influencing, but again, supported, advised. So I think that the potential is both transformative and challenging from the encounter between the artificial intelligence and the law and justice system. First of all, we have many devices based on mathematics that need to be accessible and readable, but accountable to whom? Who is in charge? If you have a judicial mistake, who is accountable for this? If the judicial decision-making is based both on human and artificial intelligence. I'm a little bit provocative, but I think that we need to plan ahead in order to make prevention. Something that is important, I think, in this context of the OECD, and it has been already addressed at the level of CEPAGE, rightly, I think so, the fact that you have a case law data set that most of the time can go beyond the national borders, but then justice is based, on domestic judicial systems. So I think that, again, we need to address this issue, and finally, but maybe, you know, most important of all, the trust of people. So my last slide is where we are from. This is just to be, you know, you will find in my presentation is a little bit of a provocation, but this is the most important. I mean, we are not at the, we do not start from zero. We have many works and some normative frameworks that are guiding, are casting light on the future. On the data protection at the European level, we have now the General Data Protection Regulation, which is extremely important in terms of how you deal with the data set on case laws. In the end of 2018, the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence set by the European Commission drafted the ethic guidelines for trustworthy artificial intelligence, and most importantly, the CEPEJ adopted in December 2018 the ethical charter on the use of artificial intelligence in judicial systems. So to conclude, I have here just a proposal for the OECD Advisory Research Committee on Justice. I think that we need to put together the different efforts on research that are ongoing around the world on these 5 points. Mapping trust-building processes. What does it mean to have trust? We need to know, empirically speaking, because if we wanted to have a trustworthy artificial intelligence in the justice sector, we need to know how trust is built. Secondly, we need to map practices and also experimental paths where the artificial intelligence has been, you know, brought into the judiciary and the justice system in general. We need to outline a participative method to design regulation and standard. I think that the method adopted by CEPEJ has been extremely important as, you know, a start, so we have a way to follow. A call for research from young researchers can be very useful. Artificial intelligence is extremely interesting for young researchers all over the world, and we need to have data before we start to make regulation. And finally, drawing a line between what is used in a very misleading manner between data, information, knowledge, and shared knowledge. Most of the time we mix all things all over, and this is not exactly a very good starting point to create trust. Thank you very much.
We are thanking you, Daniela, for this broad and provocative, for good reason, provocative approach on the topic. And not to lose much time from the time we have planned for discussing a little bit, I hand over directly to Ludwig Wohl to be last not least in our session. And we need the device again.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Ludwig Bull, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer at CourtQuant. Okay, if we can get my slides up, fantastic. Today, let me tell you a little bit about what we do at CourtQuant. I'll tell you a little bit about litigation finance, and then why we think this has a very strong application to access to justice. Now, I should mention, I thought it was very interesting, George mentioned the CourtQuant initiative. So we're a business based in London and with a secondary office in Bratislava. And even though some of the things that I tell you about today might seem a bit futuristic, this is something that's not an idea or a proposal. This is a company that's working right now. I also thought it was quite funny how my name tag listed Ludwig Bull as other. I had to sort of cross that through. Okay, let's get started. Essentially, this is the type of litigation that we are interested in and that we work with. And we really see litigation as something of a transparent financial asset. Now, this is really our vision for what we provide our clients with. We want to help them look at litigation as a transparent financial asset. So we'll get to our clients in a moment, but in order for me to explain that, let me just tell you a little bit about what we actually do. So CourtQuant is a technology system. It's a platform online that you can use, that you can submit documents to, and that analyzes cases. And what we can do with artificial intelligence is we can predict all of these variables. Okay, so we can tell you what is the likelihood of settling this case before trial, what is going to be the outcome of the case if it goes to trial, timelines, how long will this take for the case to be resolved, costs, awards, all of these things we can predict with our system with very high accuracies actually. And something else that we also offer is the litigation background check. Now this is all sorts of background information about the parties involved and the lawyers. So for example, we have the win rates of every single lawyer in certain countries. And this is a little bit of a secret of our trade. When we're in a meeting, we never tell a lawyer their win rate. I thought that was funny, anyway. Right. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about our clients. So again, just to reiterate, right? When you have all of these variables and you see how much money you can actually get and recover from a claim for money, when you know how much time it's going to take for that case to be resolved, when you know the different probabilities of settling the case, what the award range will be when it's settled, of winning the case at trial, and how much you will actually recover, then your litigation starts looking a lot like this. Now that's important for a whole number of reasons, and I'll explain also why access to justice can hugely benefit from being able to turn certain types of commercial litigation into this. Okay, so we provide this as a risk analysis tool for litigation finance. Now, probably you already know a lot about litigation finance, but just as a brief background, the idea is very simple. If you want to sue someone, let's say a company or a company you work for a big, large amount of money, let's say 10 million pounds, but you don't have enough money to actually bring the case, or you're afraid that if you lose, you have to pay all of the legal expenses and get nothing, then you can go to a litigation fund. And a litigation fund will give you money, will pay for your legal expenses, and if you win and you recover the sum, you pay some of that money back to the litigation funder, so they make a profit, and you keep the rest. But if you lose, the litigation funder pays all of your costs and legal expenses. So that's access to justice in reality as well, because it encourages people who cannot pursue claims because of the prohibitive cost of litigation. It allows them to actually do that. Now we help litigation funders figure out which cases they should invest in by looking at the risk. Okay, we'll get back to that in 1 second. So this is just how big is the litigation funding market. It's a really small market. I mean, that's absolutely nothing compared to, let's say, the bond market. And why is it so small? It's small because the people who really need funding don't get it. And this brings me to litigation finance and access to justice, because the average claim size, the average sum of the type of case where our funder clients invest is north of £1 million. If you're not suing someone for at least £1 million, better probably 10 or even 100 million pounds, then a litigation funder won't be that interested. Now, why is that? Well, it's because they spend a lot of time and money on analyzing the case, because they have lawyers sitting in an office that have to read the entire documentation, have to figure out whether this case is actually worth investing in. But with technology, you can reduce that cost so much that you can fund cases of much smaller claim sizes. And this is what we are doing right now in partnership with a new litigation finance firm in the UK, where we are one of the first funders that are actually able to fund cases with claim sizes around £100,000 because we use technology in the assessment process. Okay, so by using our systems, or by using artificial intelligence, you can reduce the costs of actually analyzing these cases so much that you can afford to fund much smaller claim sizes. And those are the people that actually need the funding because, you know, on the other hand, you're just funding huge companies suing other huge companies, which is you know, a big market. But if we're talking about access to justice, then these are the people who actually need the money the most. Okay. Yes, it's about justice. Another thing that we do is risk analysis for AT and BTE. So this is very similar to litigation funding because it's an insurance product that allows you to recover the money that you have to pay if you lose your case. So if you want to bring a case against some company and you're afraid of losing and having to pay all of the legal expenses, and in the UK you have to pay your legal expenses and a certain percentage, if not all of the other parties' legal expenses, then you can take on an insurance product to insure against that loss. So in case you do lose the case, the insurance company will pay for the difference. Now we work with some of the largest AT providers in the UK. And again, when you turn litigation into something that looks like a financial asset, all of these types of insurance products, financial products arise around it that can really substantially make a difference to people who want to pursue litigation. Okay, let's talk about policy and research. So there's a couple of different things I wanted to bring to this conference. And by the way, thank you very much for having me. So there's different areas of interest for us in working with governments and in working on innovation in the justice system. I mean, obviously, access to data, this was a point which was mentioned in many of the different speeches. I think Piana had also mentioned the access to data point, which I thought was very important, and also the data structuring. So we're hearing that in Singapore, for example, there's already been a lot of progress on this front, but in a lot of countries, even though the data might be there, and even though it might even be digitalized, you're still sitting on millions of text documents. That's nothing you can really use for an AI system. So we have built great structuring pipeline where we can actually structure all of this text data and to turn it into something useful for analysis. Right, we have these ideas of rule of law score. So if we can analyze all of the decisions made in a particular jurisdictions, then we can figure out the correlations between various variables in the outcomes. We can tell you how important race is, for example, or whether sex makes a difference to the outcome of a case. If we have the data, if it's structured, we can correlate that. And you can think about computing, let's say, a score of how much certain variables impact outcomes, and then you can think about the benchmarks and say, well, this actually is a jurisdiction that has a very high rule of law score because it does not correlate with things that should not matter. Another interesting concept, which isn't on here, but which I think would be very interesting, is, if you think about litigation finance on the one hand, and you think about microfinance on the other, and you put those two together with technology, then you start to get a very interesting application of the type of technology that we use, where, again, for us, the additional cost of actually doing this analysis per case is so small that we've now gotten to £100,000 of claim size. We can do that. But you can go even lower. And for access to justice, that's the area that's most important. So if you can think about microfinance solutions, and you can think about litigation finance, and you say, well, why don't we enable people to take on even smaller amounts, provide them with capital in order to pursue a claim, do the analysis with technology, which allows us to actually offer that because the price comes down, then I think putting those two things together can be super interesting and hugely beneficial for loads of people who can pursue their rights. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Yeah, this is the Supreme Court of the People's Republic of China. They also have a huge innovation center there, and they're looking to automate a lot of their judicial decision-making, which I think is, well, pretty aggressive. And, I just put this slide up here because we were also talking to them a while ago, but, these things are happening in practice really quickly. Loads of countries around the world, and China is a good example, are really attacking this topic very aggressively. And I think that in order for anyone really to secure, let's say a very strong technological advantage, or even to be able to provide these kind of systems to their citizens and to be able to compete on a global scale, it's really important to start iterating with technology and to start implementing solutions. And this brings me to the final point. You know, we're hugely interested in working with governments. We've done some work with governments in the past, and because we're a relatively young company, we can work really quickly, and we can do data structuring, we can do the analysis, we can advise on things. So thanks a lot for your attention. That's my email, cto@courtquant.com. That's my telephone number. Please do reach out, please do come and find me later, and I'm very happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thanks for presenting not only efficiently, but also efficiently funding and bringing up the idea of funding disputes. I was even thinking while you were talking about technology is providing now the ability to fund smaller cases, and we're citing this 100,000 pounds threshold a little bit. That even technology is enabling me to sue my airline for this 250th compensation on delay, because just technology in the background is able to give an estimation if this is successful or not, and then law companies are taking the business over. So a lot of advantages on that kind of side. To make sure, even if it's 12:45 now, a few minutes or a few questions, if they are quite brief, to take from the floor, and I may hand over on the right side immediately, please.
Hi, thanks so much for all of your presentation. That was really great. Question to Ludwig. To the extent that you're doing this...
We can't hear you. Can you please use my phone? Thank you.
Question for Ludwig. To the extent that you're doing this in the UK, where are you actually getting the case law data from? Because, as I understand it, your website says you've got a corpus of 300,000 judgments. All of the publicly available sources of case law prohibit programmatic extraction of the kind that you've just described. So where does your actual case law data come from?
Yeah, so the question is just what our databases are, right?
Where
the
did you
data
get the
comes
case law
from.
data from?
Yeah, so there's multiple data sources. There's some public ones in the UK and around the world. There's also a lot of proprietary data that we have. We work with some large providers of data there, and also obviously our clients have a lot of data as well, which we then have to go in and structure. For example, in the insurance space, they've collected loads of data over a large amount of time, and then we really work with our clients to help them to analyze that data.
I understand on the insurance side, but in terms of the case law, which public sources are you relying on?
Happy to have a conversation with you about that afterwards.
Okay. Interesting. One further question, just quickly. I think, Daniela, your presentation in the question, access to what, I think was such a good question. And I wonder, it's a question that we're grappling with in the UK around online dispute resolution. And the question that I have is, are we letting technology off too easily, in the sense that a lot of what we talk about is technology for promoting access to settlement? Well, we know that technology can do that, but what could technology do to help ensure that people actually secure their rights? It seems to me in technology a lot of the debate is around making access to justice synonymous with access to settlement. But in areas like the area that Luke talked about, that's an issue of individual rights versus the state. And what we really want is technology that helps to ensure that people's rights aren't being violated. Have you got any good examples of where technology is being used for that purpose rather than simply to promote settlement?
Thank you for this question. I think that you touch a crucial point. In my understanding, we have a lot of expectations toward technology, and we would like to ask a technology to do something that presumably, traditional systems have not been able to deliver, or not fully. Two things. First of all, equal treatment. As technology standardized, because of course it is, the architecture of technological systems is made in this way, we expect equality ensured through technological devices, which is absolutely not necessarily the case. It might be the case, but technology alone can do not that much. And secondly, I think that it is important to consider in which context you allow technology to get in. Where you have systems with low trust in traditional systems, technology may be presented, may be perceived as a sort of a panacea, which is absolutely not the case, we know. But nevertheless, it's important to create a public awareness and a very critical review about the use of technology and the expectations that we have, not to use technology, but to use it in a more responsible and responsive manner.
Thanks a lot. We have another question here, the lady on the left. Thank you.
Thank you. It's Ilaria Bottigliero from IDLO. Thank you for the interesting discussion. I have a very basic question, considering that we are talking about people-centered justice. Have you ever considered doing a gender analysis and evaluating the impact of new technologies and technologies in general on women, considering that women have very specific justice needs, given that women in most countries cannot access technology at the same level as men, and also given that women are grossly underrepresented in the design of technology, especially artificial intelligence and new technologies in general. Thank you.
Thank you for that important remark, and I may come back and wrap it up with a very last question to Luc. As he was talking about data mining and the question beforehand on even how where the data are coming from, the finances are then relying on, for example, reminds me on one hand that a colleague of mine recently said, Google knows more about me than my mother. And so we shouldn't be surprised that big data analysis is telling us a lot of interesting information about customers' behavior also in our branches. But you brought up this example of, let's say, data mining on the courts client, where you simply ask for the zip code and then draw up a map. And my question would be, if this kind of data is already used for political decisions, that you consider then redrawing the map simply because of the demand of the clients, or is it just too far?
Thanks. So yeah, the purpose of it is to obviously understand where our users are located, and then purely to make decisions about the delivery of the service. So whether that is, in that example, about providing face-to-face assisted digital services in certain areas, and or the actual provision of hearing centres. To come on to the question about gender, that's certainly in terms of our evaluation of our services to collect the protected characteristics that we need to understand whether the impacts of our reforms are having a particular effect against gender or race or other factors. And certainly in terms of the design of the services, we would be designing those services with a population that's representative of those who are using it. So if there is a particular service that is more likely to be used by women, then the user research would be done with those groups. So hopefully their thoughts are fully represented and co-created with them.
Thanks for that, and I guess this was a wonderful wrap-up of the topic with a very multi-dimensional approach, but for sure showing also that the gap on justice is to be closed, or is sometimes easy to be closed with modern technology, even taking the risks into account or having a high level of awareness in regard of that risk. Saying this, I may thank all the panelists for their very interesting and various inputs. Thanks for the questions and the attentive listening to them. And before we switch over to the lunch break, I'm asked to announce on technical note that there is a breakout session on building the case, which is taking place here in the big room. So we ask all the other participants who have their breakout sessions in other rooms to take their belongings off the main room, because otherwise we cannot readjust here, and to look at the screens where there are the information about what kind of room is attached to what kind of session, and the rooms are labeled as well. You passed them when you went for the coffee break before. Saying this, anything else on the technical level, or otherwise I think we can switch over to the lunch break and continue as designed. Which time do we continue? As scheduled. Okay. Thanks a lot.